But even with all that, some of the things reported here make everyday oddities look completely normal. These anecdotes evoke a fascinating intrigue, piquing the curiosity of both the believer and the skeptic alike. Every now and then, something a little more unusual catches one's eye. Individuals enjoying leisurely strolls suddenly spot an unusual glow where it ought not to be. Hikers glimpse a towering silhouette amid the trees and think, well, that most definitely wasn't a deer. Beachgoers observe an entity emerging from the depths of the sea that evidently isn't a fisherman returning home. Tonight, we've gathered 10 such peculiar tales for you to muse over as you drift into slumber. They are calm, subdued accounts of encounters that left witnesses bewildered long after the occurrences faded into memory. These are not frightening narratives. They are the sort of instances that prompt a moment of reflection, urging one to replay them in their mind and ponder what truly was lurking out there in the peaceful English night. So, let's settle in, shall we? Our first tale unfolds in Todmorden during 1980. In West Yorkshire, the road coursing through Todmorden was serenely silent just before dawn, that particular stillness amplifying each minor sound. A light rain had passed a mere few moments prior, leaving Burnley Road slick and glistening with an almost ethereal silver sheen as the streetlights caught the puddles scattered along the way. Police Constable Alan Godfrey navigated the road at a sluggish pace, his gaze fixed on the way his headlights cast shadows that danced across the tarmac, making it appear as though the water beneath the car was alive. He had been dispatched to investigate reports of cattle that had mysteriously vanished from a nearby farm. The assignment felt mundane. Nothing indicated that this shift would evolve into one of the most perplexing evenings of his career. Initially, the only irregularity came as a slight jolt when the patrol car wheeled over a section of uneven pavement. The tires slipped momentarily, and he corrected his steering before continuing on his way. As he approached a straight expanse of road bordered by a line of terrace houses, something in the distance captured his attention. At first glance, he assumed a bus had halted in the middle of the street, though the silhouette appeared somewhat distorted. Slowing his pace, he allowed the headlights to illuminate the object more thoroughly. What he beheld defied immediate comprehension. The structure was substantial, approximately 20 feet long, resembling the upper half of a bus set down on the road devoid of wheels. The surface gleamed metallically, yet it possessed an oddly smooth quality that eluded simple description. Nothing about its formation indicated construction or assembly. There were no seams, no rivets, no markings, and no windows. Beneath the craft, something spun, and Godfrey later likened it to a conveyor belt, rotating steadily without making contact with the road. The entire object hovered slightly above the ground, the rainwater having gathered everywhere but directly underneath it. In the reflection cast by his headlights, the dry oval beneath the craft stood out sharply, as if the object were repelling moisture from around it. Reaching for his radio to report a possible obstruction on the road, he was met with a sharp crackle of static that caused him to pull it back momentarily. Attempting once more, he was met only with an overwhelming noise. He remained still, fixated on the object, torn between the instinct to approach it or wait for backup. A bizarre sensation settled within him, akin to the shifting air pressure preceding a storm. The hairs on his arms began to stand on end, and he sensed an unusual tension enveloping the atmosphere around him. It was an indefinable change, urging his instincts from routine observation to silent apprehension. He acted in accordance with his training, retrieving his notebook and commencing a sketch of the object. His hand trembled slightly, although he did not yet feel fear. He desired a concrete record of what lay before him, as every detail already seemed too surreal to fully entrust to memory. As he sketched, an abrupt flash of white light enveloped the patrol car. It arrived without any forewarning, a brightness so intense that he instinctively raised his arm to shield his face. In the next instant, he found himself further down Burnley Road, driving as if nothing had transpired. His hand rested firmly on the steering wheel, while the notebook lay discarded on the passenger seat. He braked abruptly, pulling over, and for several seconds he sat in contemplative silence. A sense of disorientation washed over him, prompting him to turn in his seat and gaze behind him. The road appeared deserted. The object had vanished. Rain cascaded down in a typical fashion. The radio crackled back to life. Glancing at the dashboard clock, a creeping wave of confusion enveloped him. Over 20 minutes had elapsed since he first encountered the craft, and he had no way to account for that lost time. He returned to the station and recounted the incident just as it had transpired. Anticipating skepticism, he was surprised when the superintendent listened intently and dispatched 2 fellow officers to investigate the site. Upon their arrival, they discovered an oval patch of dry tarmac precisely where Godfrey had described. Even though the rain had uniformly soaked the rest of the roadway, neither officer could rationalize why that specific area remained untouched. Later that day, the missing cattle were located in a field that had undergone thorough searches twice already. Strangely, they were found standing in a formation several witnesses would later describe as semicircular. Remarkably, there were no visible injuries among the animals, nor were there any footprints leading them to their current position. The farmers were utterly baffled as to how the cattle had arrived without leaving any trace in the saturated soil. 2 days after the sighting, a body was discovered not far from where Godfrey had observed the craft. The man was identified as Zygmunt Adamski, who had been missing for 5 days from a town located nearly 20 miles away. His body lay atop a mound of coal near the railway line. His clothing remained largely intact, albeit arranged in peculiar fashion, and his shoes were tied in a manner that his family insisted he never used. There were scorch marks evident on his scalp, neck, and shoulders. A viscous, gel-like substance encrusted the injuries, leaving the coroner perplexed regarding its nature. The burns themselves were peculiar, diverging from the standard injuries associated with fire or chemicals. Although heart failure was declared the official cause of death, the medical examiner candidly acknowledged that the circumstances presented were unlike anything he had previously encountered. Constable Godfrey stood as the attending officer at the site. He found it impossible to dismiss the troubling timing, a mysterious craft, a lapse of time, baffling burns, and a man discovered in an area that didn't correspond to any rational path. In the ensuing days, he began to grapple with fleeting, intrusive visions. He found himself experiencing bright light, a feeling of weightlessness, and the impressions of shadows that felt unnaturally tall. Reluctantly, he consented to partake in hypnotic regression. The sessions unfolded under hypnosis, capturing details of his experience. He recounted being situated in a brilliantly lit chamber with illumination emanating uniformly from every direction. He felt immobilized, encircled by figures that defied human characteristics. These entities appeared elongated, with thin limbs and large, dark eyes. Among them stood a man who bore human traits, speaking with a calm demeanor. Though his words remained inaudible to Godfrey, he described a sensation akin to electric currents pulsating across his skin, notably along his hands and feet. Following the session, he noticed a small circular mark on his foot. This mark, reddish and slightly raised, resembled a burn yet exhibited no surrounding inflammation. Medical professionals were unable to ascertain its origin, and it healed at an unusually rapid pace. Godfrey opted to keep this detail mostly to himself. He had no desire to frame his experience as a spectacle, nor did he want the physical blemish to serve as a distraction from his credibility. Pressure gradually accumulated within the police department. While some colleagues stood by him, others perceived the incident as a source of humiliation. His involvement in other cases became increasingly complicated. He later remarked that while the UFO incident did not terminate his career, it did alter the perception his peers held of him. Eventually, he departed the force, embracing a more subdued existence, although he continued to recount the Todd Morton incident whenever inquiries arose. His narrative remained unchanged. He vividly recalled the object. He could bring to mind the flash. All subsequent memories he attributed to hypnosis, neither conscious nor deliberate. The Ministry of Defense undertook a brief review of the case. Their internal notes exhibited a mild curiosity. However, no comprehensive investigation ever materialized. The case was labeled as unsolved and deemed insignificant to national defense. This classification was characteristic of the era, often assigned to cases that officials wished to bypass. The MOD neglected to pursue leads concerning the radio disturbances, the time lapse, the dry patch on the road, or the implications of the hypnosis sessions. Once the file was closed, no further inquiries were initiated. The mysterious death of Adamski lingered without resolution. Investigators faced barriers in determining how he had arrived at the coal pile. There existed no footprints, no drag marks, nor any compelling rationale for his journey over that distance. The unusual burns on his body continued to haunt the coroner. The viscous gel present on the wounds never found identification. Patterns of injury did not align with usual fatalities linked to exposure. When interviewed regarding the possibility of human intervention causing the burns, the coroner admitted his uncertainty. That response resonated and lingered in the minds of many. As the years rolled on, the Todd Morton incident evolved into one of Britain's most frequently discussed UFO occurrences, a result of the witness's credibility and the unanswered questions surrounding Adamski's death. Godfrey always emphasized his disinterest in garnering publicity. He was convinced that two distinct events transpired within the same week, both eluding straightforward explanation. While he refrained from declaring a definitive connection between them, he acknowledged that the timing made it challenging to dismiss the possibility entirely. The recollection of the craft remained one of his most vivid memories. The shape, the bizarre dry patch beneath it, the conveyor belt motion it seemed to embody, and the profound silence remained etched in his mind. The time he could not reconcile remained a chasm he learned to accommodate rather than comprehend. In the town of Todd Morton, residents never fully moved on from that week in 1980. The abandoned cattle, the charred man upon the coal heap, and the stealthy craft on Burnley Road forged an undercurrent of unease intertwined with the town's narrative. Even the skeptics regarding extraterrestrial involvement conceded that the sequence of events lacked a satisfying explanation. Godfrey continued to ponder the occurrences with a placid demeanor in later years. He believed something transpired on that road, transcending the limits of ordinary experience and leaving him with enigmas destined to linger unanswered. He came to terms with the pervasive silence enveloping both cases. Silence from officials, silence regarding those lost minutes, silence on the fragments of the event that remained obscured in the recesses of his memory. The Todd Morton incident stands unresolved. No evidence has emerged to contradict Godfrey's account. No corroborative details have surfaced either. What persists is a constellation of details that refuse to align neatly, yet remain inseparable. A craft perched upon a damp road, leaving behind only a patch of dryness. A man found with inexplicable burns. A police constable contending with 20 lost minutes of his life. And a town forever tethered to two enigmas that remained unanswered. The schoolyard egg-shaped craft encounter marked 1979 over Greater Manchester. The sky that morning wore a drab gray hue, a dullness that seemed to mute the entire vista. The children flooded onto the playground shortly after break time, scattering into small groups while the teachers lingered near the entrances, casting half-hearted glances towards the yard. It was an ordinary morning, enveloped in a tranquil stillness, devoid of anything peculiar or tense. Yet, several of the children later recounted a sense of something subtly shifting within the atmosphere, as if an unseen event was quietly unraveling behind or above them, just beyond their conscious grasp. They would describe it in hindsight as a gentle pressure building in their minds, akin to a thought struggling to articulate itself before they were fully prepared to comprehend it. One younger boy abruptly halted his race and turned his attention toward the fence bordering the field. Something beyond the trees captivated him, though he could neither define nor articulate what compelled him to look. Gradually, a few others began to follow his gaze, initially moving slowly, as if drawn not merely by curiosity, but by an instinctual pull. In mere moments, the games fell silent, and conversations faded into an uneasy hush. A group amassed along the edge of the fence, their demeanor neither one of exuberance nor fear, but marked by an odd, concentrated focus. Behind the foliage, an object began its descent, gliding slowly as if it were descending with meticulous deliberation. Oval in shape, It was metallic and smooth, comparable in size to a compact car. It did not rotate or drift aimlessly. Instead, it settled into position, hovering several feet above the ground. There was an eerie absence of sound, no tremors rippling through the air, not even the slightest rustling of leaves. The atmosphere around it felt unnaturally still, with several children recalling that the silence felt overwhelmingly profound, as if someone had subtly lowered the world's volume. A few children edged closer to the fence, while others remained frozen in their tracks. Their focus on the object was intense, an intensity the teachers later found difficult to articulate. Some commented that it appeared as though the children were attuned to something beyond sound, despite the absence of any audible noise. One girl recounted a sensation akin to a small tug within her mind, reminiscent of someone calling her name without words. A figure stood poised at the base of the craft, slender, pale, and thin, neither fully childlike nor unmistakably adult, but something in between. It remained perfectly still, facing the children, its slight angle suggesting a posture of contemplation, but without a hint of movement. Multiple witnesses described its demeanor as if it were awaiting something, fixating on the children as if it were conducting some quiet examination devoid of vision. None of the children remembered the figure appearing. It was simply there amongst them. One boy, nearest the fence, later communicated to investigators that in an instant he became aware of something he had never been taught. He insisted he knew, without clarity of understanding, that the object posed no threat, at least not in a way he could readily define as danger. Another child expressed a feeling that the figure bore genuine curiosity about them. Yet again, these impressions came devoid of any words. Intriguingly, these sentiments echoed across their individual narratives, despite them being interviewed separately. The first teacher on the scene first sensed a deepening silence before noting the unusual assemblage of the children. She articulated that the playground had seemed to drain itself of sound, even with dozens of children only a short distance away. As she approached, the children remained seemingly oblivious to her presence, their attention fixed on the fence, transfixed as if enveloped in a daydream. She called out, yet only a handful turned to acknowledge her. Several remained locked on the object, while two seemed entirely unaware of her at all. Their expressions were distant, as if they were ensnared in a reverie. She reached the fence just as the craft began to shift. It ascended vertically, initially with a smooth and unhurried manner, devoid of visible propulsion. Without a moment's notice, it came to a halt, suspended in the air with perfect steadiness. In that transient stillness, several children would later describe an impression that time had briefly slowed, not completely stopped, but slowed nonetheless. One child conveyed that the air felt heavy, as if that moment had drawn out longer than it ought to have. Another remarked that the teacher's voice seemed like it emanated from underwater for a few brief seconds. The figure standing by the trees vanished in unison with the craft's sudden motion. There was no backing away, no blurring, simply a disappearance. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, all returned to normal pace. The object shot upwards, disappearing into a pale dot in the sky before the teacher could fully react to the swift movement. It left no trace of smoke, no sound, nor any disturbance among the trees. The children blinked as though awakening from a slumber, some staggering slightly. One girl, bewildered, asked why everyone had congregated by the fence, completely unaware of having walked there. Another boy glanced down, surprised to find his hands gripping the fence tightly, despite having no memory of seizing it. Some children confronted the enigma head-on, seeking an explanation for what had transpired, while others staunchly insisted they recalled every detail. A small group described a moment in which the trees appeared abnormally tall, as though the very ground had shifted beneath them. The teacher guided them back to the school, her feelings unsettled. Something about the children's movements disquieted her. Several exhibited signs of confusion, shuffling along at an unusually slow pace. One boy rubbed his temples, as if afflicted with a headache, while a girl queried whether the teacher had called her name previously, for she thought she had heard it in her mind. Inside the school, the children were encouraged to express their experiences through writing or drawing. The headmaster believed that this exercise would offer a method for them to articulate what they had witnessed. Unexpectedly, it yielded a level of consistency that stirred unease among the staff. The shapes depicted in the drawings were strikingly alike, an oval craft, metallic and smooth, silent in presence. Almost all illustrations portrayed the figure, varying in height, but maintaining a constant thinness and pallor. Many children used the identical phrase to encapsulate the craft's essence, its quiet hovering. A few students added curiosities they had neglected to mention verbally. One boy illustrated the object, surrounded by faint lines, claiming it seemed as though the air was warping around it. Another child depicted an interior space he asserted he almost remembered. On further inquiry, he detailed a room illuminated by soft light, but he could not fathom the origin of this memory. He was adamant that he had not been inside the craft, rather the image had materialized in his mind, unbidden. That particular detail was withheld from the parents. The headmaster reached out to the local police department. An officer came, interviewed several children, and inspected the playground and surrounding field. Ultimately, he found no signs of disturbance, no footprints beyond those of the children, no scorch marks, no indentation markings to indicate anything had disturbed the ground. The officer observed that some of the children struggled to remember the moments that followed the object's departure. One boy recalled watching it ascend, but could not recall how he moved away from the fence. A girl expressed a sensation of having lost part of the morning. Though these lapses were minor, they emerged frequently enough across accounts that the officer duly noted them in his report. When he inquired about whether anyone had heard voices, most children responded negatively. However, one child claimed he heard his name echoing in his mind. Another insisted that someone posed a question to him, though he found it baffling. The officer recorded these assertions without additional commentary, but later confided to a colleague that the children remained remarkably composed for witnesses of such an extraordinary event. The school subsequently reached out to a nearby aerodrome to investigate any potential aircraft activity. The aerodrome confirmed that there were no scheduled flights, balloons, helicopters, or training exercises in the area at that time. Moreover, radar surveillance showed nothing out of the ordinary. The officer relayed this information to a regional investigator specializing in aerial anomalies, though no representative from the Ministry of Defense visited the school in the aftermath. Eventually, the headmaster advised the staff to refrain from promoting further discussion about the incident. Over the course of the next few nights, some children began to experience recurring dreams. One child recounted a vision of a brilliantly lit room, unsure if he had ever been in such a place. Another girl spoke of dreaming of standing beneath an overwhelmingly white sky, the meaning of which eluded her. These dreams faded after several days. Remarkably, as the years wore on, many of these children retained their memories with a clarity that defied the passage of time. Now, adults, they articulated the event with an unmistakable precision: the craft, the silence, the ethereal figure, and the sensation of being observed from within rather than from outside. They refrained from claiming abduction, but acknowledged a feeling that something had infiltrated their thoughts that morning, which did not emanate from themselves. One individual described the sensation of being studied for his thought processes rather than his appearance. A few maintained fleeting impressions of an incongruous presence amidst the familiar landscape, recalling shapes, bursts of light, and the sensation of being scrutinized from multiple angles. One woman shared that occasionally, when she pondered the incident, she remembered a domed ceiling, though she had no comprehension as to why. She asserted her conviction that she had never entered the craft and did not subscribe to the notion of abduction. Rather, the memory seemed to exist within her mind, as if deliberately implanted rather than authentically experienced. The event evolved into yet another whisper in the annals of British encounters, but it bore characteristics that investigators identified as hallmarks of the fourth kind. The pervasive stillness, the telepathic impressions, the fragmentary memory lapses, the flashes of interior experience that clashed with the visible reality, the disquieting manipulation of time, and the object's abrupt disappearance. All of this unfolded with an eerie consistency, complemented by the calm tones of the witnesses, who recounted occurrences that seemed irrevocably disconnected from the mundanity of the everyday world. They had witnessed something, felt something. And while they resumed their roles in classrooms and returned to the rhythm of lessons, the memory of that silent oval craft hovering behind the trees remained etched in their minds. The sky reverted to its customary grayness. The playground resumed its usual clamor. Yet for those children, something had already crossed into their ordinary existence, leaving behind an inexplicable moment. A moment that, even years on, resonated as an encounter more entangled with their thoughts than their sight. The Solway FTH spaceman photograph from 1964 in Berg by Sands whispers of a similarly quiet day in the marshland during May of that year. A brisk breeze stirred over the Solway FTH, carrying with it the faint scent of seawater and the distant cries of birds that nested along the tidal flats. The grass shifted gently in the wind, and overhead the sky bore a mostly clear complexion, with only a delicate veil of pale cloud tracing the horizon. Jim Templeton, a 35-year-old firefighter hailing from Carlisle, ventured to the marsh with his daughter Elizabeth to capture photographs. This tranquil location was cherished by their family, a flat, serene expanse rarely disturbed by passers-by. He found the seclusion provided the best natural settings for their pictures. On that day, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, nor did anything convey a sense of the unusual. It was merely a pleasant outing with his daughter. Elizabeth lingered in a patch of heather, her smile embodying the blend of shyness and delight characteristic of children. Jim lifted his camera, a Kodak SLR, and snapped 3 frames in rapid succession. He assessed the wind direction, readjusted Elizabeth's positioning, and captured another image while she gazed downwards. He distinctly recalled thinking that the lighting was just right. After repositioning her once more, he took one final photograph before they began their journey home. Throughout this time, he had seen nothing looming behind her. Not a single soul wandered nearby. The marshland appeared deserted, save for the 2 of them. A few days later, as Jim developed the photographs at a pharmacy in Carlisle, the clerk regarded him with a peculiar expression. She queried whether he had taken the pictures recently, to which he affirmed. When she inquired about anyone else accompanying them in the marsh, he confidently replied no. She revealed that one of the photographs depicted a figure hovering behind his daughter, clad in what seemed to be a suit of white or silver. Jim chuckled, dismissing the notion as a processing blunder, or perhaps a flare captured on the lens. Yet when she presented the print, his laughter dissipated abruptly. Behind Elizabeth, positioned almost directly over her shoulder, was a tall figure. This entity donned what appeared to be a reflective helmet or headpiece, and its suit, bright white and bulky, seemed designed to endure pressure with its rigid contours around the shoulders. The figure stood at an angle, one arm slightly elevated while the other rested at its side. Even in this seemingly natural posture, its presence felt profoundly unsettling. Jim gazed intently at the photograph, grappling with how such an unsettling figure could loom behind them without his awareness. The marshland was wide and open, the land stretched flat, devoid of any place for an observer to conceal themselves. The chemist inquired if he wished to have the photograph reprinted. Jim accepted the print, convinced he would uncover a flaw or reflection that would bring clarity to the mystery. He scrutinized the negative with meticulous attention. The figure stood out, clear and sharply defined. It was not a reflection of Elizabeth, nor could it be dismissed as a shadow. Overexposure was also ruled out. The technicians at Kodak examined the negative, affirming its authenticity with no evidence of tampering or accidental double exposure. In fact, the company featured the image in internal training sessions to illustrate the characteristics of a pristine negative. Word of the photograph spread, and reporters began to call. The local newspaper published a brief article, followed by national outlets eager for details. Yet, none could provide an explanation for the figure's appearance. Some suggested it was merely a man with his back turned, which Jim knew was implausible, as the marsh had been deserted. Others speculated it was a passerby captured in a peculiar angle, but Jim remained adamant that no one had come near them. Elizabeth had frequently turned her head throughout their photo session. Any presence behind her would surely have elicited a response from her. Instead, she exhibited an unnerving calm. Jim found himself questioning his recollection. He replayed the afternoon in his mind like a film, desperate to salvage any sound or movement he might have overlooked. There was but one detail that stood out amid the confusion. At one juncture during their outing, Elizabeth had glanced over Jim's shoulder instead of focusing on the camera, squinting into the distance as she mentioned hearing a man laugh. Jim heard nothing. When he inquired about whom she was observing, she indicated a point on the horizon and asserted that two men were watching them. Yet, Jim saw no one. He attributed it to an overactive imagination. However, weeks later, as the photograph became a national curiosity, that detail began to gnaw at him. Shortly after the story gained traction, two men visited the fire station where Jim was employed. Clad in dark suits, their accents were peculiar, neither distinctly local nor foreign. They displayed identification that Jim later described as official, yet still unfamiliar. They claimed to be representatives of a government agency, though failed to specify which one. They requested that he accompany them back to the marsh site. Jim complied. During the drive, he couldn't help but notice how the men spoke in a strangely monotonous fashion. Their inquiries were precise and disconcerting. Did he see anyone? Did he hear anything out of the ordinary? Did he feel uneasy at any moment? He answered negatively, save for the instance when Elizabeth mentioned the laughter. Upon arriving at the marsh, they instructed him to stand where he had taken the photograph while they circled him slowly, scanning the terrain methodically. They repeatedly asked him to pinpoint the exact location of the figure. With certainty, he gestured to the familiar spot. One of the men crouched down, brushing his fingertips against the blades of grass. The other surveyed the sky above. After a lengthy period of silent observation, the men asked if Jim would consent to accompany them for further questioning at a nearby facility. When he pressed for clarification on which facility, they refused to divulge that information. He declined their offer. Their demeanor shifted, cordiality faded as they pressed him once more. His answer remained the same. Without exchanging a word, they escorted him back to their vehicle and promptly departed. In subsequent accounts, Jim described that encounter as far more distressing than the photograph itself. He had never before interacted with individuals who exhibited such peculiar behavior. The opacity of their tone, the rigidity of their mannerisms, and the invasive nature of their questions left him feeling less like a subject of assistance and more like an object of observation. Concurrently, an even stranger event unfolded, further complicating the situation. A missile test in Woomera, South Australia, ended in an unexpected failure. The missile crew reported encountering two figures clad in white suits, ominously reminiscent of the being in Jim's photograph. The launch was aborted. The following day, officials connected to the Woomera program reached out to Jim, inquiring about details of the figure and the direction he had been facing when the photograph was taken. When he described the orientation of the marshland, they remarked, almost in hushed tones, that the figure in his photograph had been lined up perfectly with the same direction of Woomera. While rarely discussed outside specialized research circles, that connection remains among the most well-documented and credible elements of the entire case. Australian officials confirmed this troubling correspondence. Afterward, sleepless nights became a common occurrence for Jim. He kept the photograph on his desk, observing it obsessively, searching for hidden clues, fleeting shadows, or deceptive reflections that might hold the answer. One consistent detail nagged at him. Elizabeth's hair appeared to be wafting slightly in the image, as if caught by a sudden gust of wind, yet he couldn't recall experiencing any breeze that day. The grass behind her lay still, and the atmosphere had been untroubled. He began to wonder if the disturbance originated from the figure itself, yet remained baffled by how that could be possible. As the photograph circulated through newspapers and television broadcasts, individuals began reaching out to Jim, insisting they too had encountered similar figures. Most were disregarded, but a number of accounts were too compelling for him to dismiss. One man from Scotland recounted an experience involving a white-suited figure standing near a reservoir late at night, vanishing instantly when approached. Another from Wales described a confrontation with a towering figure wearing a visor-like helmet situated on a hillside. These narratives bore striking similarities to the Solway figure in posture, appearance, and the underlying sense of surrealism. As Elizabeth grew older, she seldom spoke about that day. Her memories of laughter in an empty marsh remained vivid. She recalled the sight of what she perceived to be men far off in the distance, yet the photograph captured the figure directly behind her. Although she found the scenario perplexing, she maintained that she never felt fear at the moment. Rather, uncertainty lingered within her. The fear emerged later when she came to terms with the realization that something extraordinary had stood so close to her, unnoticed by her father. Jim maintained consistently throughout his life that the figure was authentic and that he had not altered the photograph in any way. He reiterated that the marsh was devoid of other people, asserting that he would have noticed someone standing merely a few feet behind his daughter. His conviction remained steadfast, even as skeptics contended that the figure was merely a passerby or a photographic anomaly. The image, however, became one of the most meticulously examined, unexplained photographs ever captured in the United Kingdom. Kodak technicians validated the authenticity of the negative repeatedly. Photographic experts sought to reproduce the effect through reflections, double exposures, and forced perspective, yet none succeeded in achieving the same clarity or depth. The figure maintained its crispness, definition, and proportion. Years later, Jim confided that he sometimes felt as though he were being watched in the months following the photograph. He heard strange clicks on his phone and noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near his street. Letters arrived without return addresses, requesting copies of the image and inquiries about the marsh. He remained uncertain if these incidents were interconnected or if he was merely searching for patterns in the aftermath of something unimaginable. Regardless, he remarked that the unsettling feeling never completely dissipated. The Solway photograph remains significant because it occupies that unique space between the impossible and the irrefutable. A child adrift in a marsh, a desolate landscape, a camera that captured something unseen by human eyes. A figure that appeared in a solitary frame, standing still, garbed in a suit that seemed too modern, too structured, and too alien for its time. What persists is the quiet assurance of a father convinced that the marsh was empty, set against the persistent unease of a world incapable of explaining the figure looming behind his child. The photograph ingrained itself in British UFO lore, not merely because of its visual impact, but due to its authenticity, an interplay of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The landscape was unremarkable. The moment felt simple. Yet, something impossible stepped into focus, unseen and leaving no trace behind. The Solway spaceman continues to resonate, a presence frozen within a singular image, observing, waiting, or evaluating from just beyond a child's shoulder. It is an encounter that remains unexposed, leaving only questions, silence, and a photograph shrouded in mystery. The Louth Canal creature encounter, occurring in 1995 in Louth, Lincolnshire, unfolded quietly along the canal path outside the town on a late August evening. The stillness enveloped the area, rendering the surrounding fields appear more expansive than they truly were. With the sun having dipped below the horizon, the sky retained only the faintest remnants of daylight. The canal's surface mirrored the hues of dusk without any ripples or disruption. 3 teenagers ambled home from a friend's residence on the outskirts, following a narrow towpath beside the water, a shortcut frequently utilized by locals. They navigated this route with ease, never feeling apprehensive about its familiarity. The air was calm, the ground slightly moist from a light rain that had fallen earlier. Everything about their journey felt routine, characterized by casual conversation, until one of the boys spotted something amidst the reeds on the opposite bank of the canal. Initially, he presumed it to be a person standing in the shallow waters, yet the figure's height appeared odd. It was tall and thin, an unusual narrowness at the shoulders, compelling him to nudge his friends for a closer look. All 3 slowed their pace, instinctively edging nearer to the path's edge. The reeds rustled faintly, though the atmosphere remained unchanged. For a brief moment, silence enveloped them. They later recounted that fear did not take hold immediately. Rather, an unusual awareness washed over them, as if something hidden within the reeds was observing intently. Gradually, the figure emerged, taking deliberate strides forward, first revealing its head, then its torso, and ultimately its full form. It positioned itself at the bank's edge, almost motionless, as if acclimating to the dwindling light. Standing over 6 feet tall, its proportions seemed unnaturally thin, limbs elongated and skin devoid of visible hair. The most disconcerting aspect was its face. One of the teenagers would recall later that its features were familiar, yet somehow distorted, human characteristics twisted into an unsettling semblance. The mouth appeared small, and the eyes strangely reflected the remaining light, lacking a discernible pupil. One boy, breaking the heavy silence, called out to inquire if it required assistance. To their bewilderment, the figure did not respond. Instead, it tilted its head in a slow, deliberate manner, akin to someone closely assessing an unfamiliar sight. As this motion transpired, the air enveloping the teenagers shifted perceptibly. They experienced a faint electric sensation along their arms, reminiscent of the tingle before an impending storm. The static sensation intensified as the figure advanced toward the water's edge, still maintaining silence. The teens recalled how the ambiance felt charged, almost oppressively thick in a manner they could not entirely articulate. Two of them instinctively retreated, while the third stood transfixed, incapable of movement and unable to tear his gaze away. This boy later described an odd numbing of his thoughts, as if something were dulling his ability to react. He initially felt no fear, but rather a sense of paralysis, as if his mind were held captive in that moment. He remembered his friends calling his name, yet their voices reached him as if through thick water, distorted and far away. As the figure stepped closer, it did not move like a standard human. One of the teenagers noted its gliding motion was too fluid, too smooth, yet its legs unmistakably shifted, breaking the stillness of the evening. As it progressed, the reeds behind it swayed gently as if caressed by a breeze, while the rest of the canal lay in an eerie stillness. The water remained unperturbed, its surface flawless even as the figure approached it, defying the very laws of nature. The boy, still paralyzed in his place, would later express that he sensed something enigmatic pervading his thoughts at that moment, not a voice or coherent language, but a compelling and intrusive awareness that the figure desired him to remain stationary. This sensation vanished as abruptly as it had arrived when one of his friends seized his arm and yanked him away. Upon regaining his wits, he felt a sudden jolt in his chest akin to the disorientation one experiences after rousing from a deep slumber too swiftly. The figure seemed to respond to their haste, briefly lifting its head and straightening. Its eyes absorbed the waning daylight, reflecting it back with a peculiar intensity that rendered them faintly luminescent. For the first time, the teenagers were enveloped by a palpable fear. Instinct kicked in, driving them to flee along the towpath. One of the boys dared to glance back just once, witnessing the figure still stationed at the water's edge, neither pursuing them nor making any movement, but simply observing. He recalled that it appeared to merge into the reeds, becoming increasingly indistinct as the twilight deepened, as though it had always belonged there. They reached the nearest road, breathless and shaken, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Minutes passed without a single word being exchanged. The boy who had been frozen earlier remarked that his thoughts felt muddled, as if the world around him only regained its clarity once they had put considerable distance between themselves and the canal. He rubbed his arms absent-mindedly, insisting that the static sensation seeming to cling to him would not dissipate. Other boys, too, shared the sensation, the faint but enduring tingling that lingered with them, even as they meandered back home. One boy felt compelled to tell his parents about the harrowing encounter. They, in turn, alerted the authorities, primarily out of concern for a potential trespasser or a distressed individual near the water. The following morning, an officer arrived at the canal. Upon inspection, he noticed the reeds along the opposite bank disturbed in a manner suggestive of something having traversed the area. The ground was soft, and he observed impressions far deeper than typical footprints, although lacking sharp details. He also remarked on the unsettling quietude enveloping the site. Birds, which would typically flock near the water, were conspicuously absent. The officer characterized the region as possessing an unusual stillness that made him uneasy. a detail he chose not to include in his official report. The subsequent day saw the boys return with 2 adults in tow. A number of dogs in the vicinity displayed apprehension, refusing to approach the expanse of reeds where the figure had lingered. One dog whimpered and violently resisted its lead, a behavior its owner asserted it had never exhibited before. Another dog growled and withdrew, its tail tucked low in agitation. The adults endeavored to delve deeper into the mystery, yet their search yielded no new findings. The only tangible remnants of the encounter were the disturbed reeds. In the week that followed, various residents reported peculiar occurrences. A nearby farmer insisted his sheep had shunned the area near the water, and a woman walking her dog recounted hearing odd clicking sounds near the canal at dusk, subsequently accompanied by a sudden and profound drop in temperature. Yet another resident claimed to have spotted a tall silhouette standing at the waterline late at night. When he directed a flashlight toward it, the shape vanished instantaneously, leaving behind only the rippling glow of his beam upon the canal's surface. The teenagers who had first witnessed the strange figure found themselves grappling with lingering effects. The boy who had felt frozen noted periods of losing track of time, fleeting moments in which minutes slipped away unnoticed. These episodes often occurred in the evenings while he sat alone or gazed into reflective surfaces. He struggled to articulate their significance. His parents dismissed his concerns as mere stress, yet he maintained that the sensations bore a striking resemblance to the paralysis he had experienced at the canal. Another boy began to have recurring dreams in which he once again stood by the canal, observing the figure emerge from the reeds. In his dreams, however, the water was illuminated by an unseen radiance. Although he never witnessed the figure drawing nearer, he awoke each time with the disconcerting feeling of being observed. These dreams persisted for months before eventually fading from his subconscious. Much later, one investigator who examined the case noted the chilling parallels to other documented humanoid encounters near bodies of water across the UK. The tall, slender silhouette, its smooth and pallid form, the silence enveloping its movements, the static energy in the air, and the general mental intrusiveness, each detail mirrored previous accounts like a haunting refrain. The investigator found the Luth case strikingly consistent for an event with multiple witnesses, particularly as each had been interviewed separately just hours after the phenomenon unfolded. He also remarked upon the prolonged reaction of the dogs, considering it noteworthy. Animals usually shy away from locations associated with electric or magnetic fields, and numerous incidents of humanoid sightings near water showed this recurring pattern. The unnerving fact that the canal remained placid during the figure's ambulation further stood out as a peculiar anomaly. In later conversations, the teenagers recounted the incident with an unsettling calmness, their tone uniformly matter-of-fact. They refrained from branding the figure as an alien or labeling it as a ghost or creature. They simply stated that it was undeniably not human, at least not in any way they were equipped to comprehend. Each boy vividly recalled the static sensation, the unnatural quietness, and the figure's intense, deliberate gaze directed at them. They all experienced a rapid resurgence of that sensation of being watched whenever they attempted to recollect the moment, as if the very act of remembrance bore an oppressive weight. The encounter at Luth Canal quietly nestled itself into British UFO and humanoid case studies, seldom discussed beyond specialized research circles. It remains one of the rare multi-witness events in the UK where a humanoid entity was observed so closely, so silently, imposing a physical presence potent enough to disrupt its surroundings. No photographs were captured. No tangible evidence was left behind. What remained was merely the shared memory of 3 teenagers traversing home on a hushed summer evening, interrupted by an enigmatic presence, tall and pale, watching them from the reeds. The canal returned to its usual rhythm within a matter of weeks. Dogs eventually resumed their explorations in the once silent area, while birds recommitted to their nests among the trees. Yet, for those who had glimpsed the figure, the memory remained untouched by time. Each subsequent journey along that familiar path bore the weight of an unspoken pact. None of them ever ventured it alone again. They often mentioned how the location felt perpetually inhabited, as if something had emerged from the reeds once and now lingered in unseen ways. This encounter is one among the peculiar incidents that evoke nothing but echoes within the minds of those who experience them. It was a fleeting disruption of everyday life, an anomaly that did not belong, combined with a palpable tension in the air, a subtle incursion into their consciousness. The stretch of canal still resonates with the memory for them, harboring the essence of something unseen, perhaps still observing from the edge of the water. As for the Ailey abduction in 1974, it was a chill night on November 27th in Ailey, Essex. The windows of the quaint homes glistened with thin lines of condensation, and the streets lay tranquil as most families nestled in for the evening. In a semi-detached house on Old Farm Road, Arthur and Mary Schold were unwinding, preparing to retire for the night. Their teenage offspring had already found their way to bed, and an atmosphere of normalcy enveloped the house. The television had slipped into silence, and the flickering hallway light cast soft shadows in the dimness. Fatigue hung over everyone after a long day, and there were no hints that the extraordinary was about to unfold. As Arthur stepped outside for a breath of evening air, he was met by a clear sky, adorned with a few wispy clouds floating lazily over Essex. He glanced upwards before turning back toward the house, but halted when he spotted a brilliant light in the distance. It radiated white brilliance, suspending itself above the nearby treetops in an unprecedented manner. It did not exhibit the typical motion of an aircraft. It remained utterly still. He observed it for several moments, anticipating its drift, a blink, or a fade, but it persistently held its position. He beckoned Mary to join him outside, and as she stood beside him, both were gripped by a shared feeling of bewilderment in the stillness. They advanced toward the front gate to get a clearer view. The light shifted imperceptibly. Rather than traversing the sky, it altered its vertical alignment, akin to someone making a precise adjustment. The intensity surged suddenly, causing them both to blink in surprise as the roof of their home was briefly illuminated with a gentle white glow. Initially, they suspected a low-flying helicopter, but the pervasive silence ruled out that notion. No engine thrummed, no distant sound rumbled, nothing. The light approached their position. Arthur later reflected that he sensed a distinct shift in the atmosphere as the object neared. The temperature plummeted, but not in a natural manner. It was sharp, reminiscent of stepping into a cold storage room. Mary felt an oppressive sensation settle in her chest, as though the air had thickened around them. Attempts to retreat toward the house were met with resistance. Their bodies responded with disconcerting slowness, each movement lagging a fraction behind their intentions. Years later, they would recount this peculiar feeling separately, using nearly identical descriptions. The light halted directly above the street, now close enough for its outline to come into focus. The object had the shape of a disc, crowned with a dome, its edges smooth and sharply defined. Small lights danced around its underside in a slow, mesmerizing pattern, proved difficult to gaze upon directly. Despite its hovering presence, the ground beneath remained undisturbed. No leaves stirred, no breeze rustled through the hedges. The object existed within an unearthly stillness. Then, in an instant too swift for either observer to grasp, a singular experience unfolded before them. Each recounted the same event. A beam of light shot forth from the craft's underside, striking the driveway before them, and the atmosphere shifted once more. They both felt a surge of energy ripple through their bodies, not painful, but perplexing. Time seemed to stretch. They could not determine if seconds or minutes passed until darkness enveloped them. Upon awakening, Arthur found himself standing in an unfamiliar room, where the ambient light was soft yet omnipresent, lacking a discernible source. The walls curvilinear, and a faint metallic scent lingered in the air. An unusual serenity washed over him, not precisely peace, but rather a dampening of his instinctive responses. He scanned his surroundings and located Mary a few feet away. Though seemingly conscious, she exhibited a similar disorientation. When she attempted to articulate her thoughts, words failed to materialize. Whether this silence originated from her or the environment around them remained unclear. Three figures stood in proximity. Tall and slender, they donned tight, seamless suits that gleamed in the muted illumination. Their heads appeared disproportionately large in relation to their bodies, while their eyes were dark, wide, and unblinking. Their skin shifted in hue from gray to pale blue, depending on the light's angle. Remarkably, none moved their lips. Arthur sensed a profound something resonate within his mind, difficult to label. It was neither a voice nor language, but an essence waiting for him to glean an understanding before any further development occurred. As one figure advanced cautiously, raising its hand in a slow, deliberate fashion, Arthur experienced a strange vibration coursing through his arms and chest. He endeavored to lift his own hand, but found it a Herculean task. No pain accompanied this sensation. Rather, it was an unusual heaviness, akin to an increased gravitational force. Mary underwent a parallel experience. She later articulated that she felt as though she were being scrutinized without touch. A wave of scanning energy traversed her form, coursing from her feet to her head. This was not an external pressure, it was an internal experience, akin to warmth followed closely by an abrupt cold. The figures moved gracefully around them, their motions precise and coordinated. One of them lightly touched Arthur's shoulder, eliciting a tingling sensation that radiated outward, spreading warmth from the contact point into his chest and abdomen. He could not ascertain whether the figure was reaching out to him. A sensation of curiosity permeated the atmosphere, though he could not pinpoint its origin. It simply lingered there, palpable and laden within the moment. Mary experienced a sudden image flash in her consciousness, a vivid but unfamiliar landscape that felt eerily bright and flat beneath a diffuse white sky devoid of sun. She found herself at a loss to determine whether the vision was a memory, a figment of imagination, or perhaps something pushed into her mind from beyond. The image vanished as quickly as it had materialized, leaving a disquieting trace behind. The figure took a step backward, and the soft illumination in the room intensified. Both Arthur and Mary perceived their vision blurring, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting. Their bodies felt buoyant, as if gravity for a brief moment had loosened its grip. They discerned the figures still present, albeit at a greater distance now, observing them with an unsettling calm. The tranquility that had enveloped them began to morph into a sense of confusion. Time itself seemed to distort, stretching initially before collapsing back into itself. Suddenly, they found themselves transported back to their driveway. The night appeared unchanged, yet an unshakable feeling crept over them that considerable time had elapsed. The celestial glow that had once filled the sky had vanished. The street was silent, the temperature returned to what could be deemed normal. The only remnant of their experience was a persistent tingling coursing through their limbs. Arthur's chest felt constricted, an uncomfortable sensation, but not overtly painful. When they attempted to converse, their voices emerged barely above a whisper, as though their throats had parched. Upon entering the house, a glance at the clock revealed that nearly 2 hours had slipped by. They both had harbored the belief that only mere minutes had elapsed. Their children lay asleep upstairs, and every detail of their domestic environment appeared undisturbed, yet they could not dispel the notion that something had irrevocably vanished from their memories. In the days that ensued, they continued to feel lingering effects of that night. Arthur found it increasingly challenging to concentrate on professional duties. His mind often drifted to reflective surfaces, feeling as though a fragment from that room hovered tantalizingly close, yet remained just out of his grasp. Mary, on the other hand, endured persistent headaches, accompanied by fleeting visions of that peculiar white landscape. Out of concern for her children's well-being, she chose to keep these experiences to herself. Several weeks later, they reached out to the Essex UFO Study Group. Investigators conducted their interviews separately, but the accounts they provided aligned closely in detail. Both recounted the same room, the same figures, and the same sensations, devoid of any exaggeration. They spoke with measured calm, pausing often as they sought words that eluded them, attempting to articulate what they had lived through. Physical remnants of the encounter were noted. Arthur bore a faint triangular mark on his upper arm, barely perceptible but identifiable under scrutiny. Mary sported a circular discoloration on her shoulder that defied classification as either bruise or burn. When examined by a doctor, both marks baffled yet intrigued. Neighbors reported witnessing an unusual bright light hovering above their residence that night, though none could describe the craft itself. One neighbor noted the light's unusual steadiness, lacking any flicker and radiating brighter than a helicopter spotlight. Another individual mentioned only after the incident that she had heard a faint humming sound around the same time, disclosing this only weeks later, emboldened by the growing discussion of the event. The Ministry of Defense acknowledged a report from a local police constable, but chose not to pursue an investigation. Classified as inconsequential from a defense perspective, this case bore the standard designation in the 1970s, particularly due to the absence of radar corroboration. The official file contained merely a short note summarizing the event. Years later, Arthur began expressing feelings of being observed in the wake of that strange night. He described moments of waking to the sensation that his room was illuminated far beyond the absence of light. Mary recounted how she sometimes felt a presence standing watchfully at the foot of their bed, though she had never caught a glimpse of it. In spite of these peculiar sensations, neither claimed to have experienced further encounters. They were certain that the event had been isolated, an unanticipated visitation that arrived without prior indication and departed without explanation, fundamentally altering their perception of the nature of reality. The Avely abduction remains a seminal close-contact case in British UFO history, distinguished by the composed consistency exhibited by its witnesses and the physical and psychological ramifications documented afterward. It exists within that peculiar realm of encounters where memory, time, and perception intertwine, a brief incursion into the fabric of ordinary life, leaving no outward imprints yet indelibly marking those who experienced it. Arthur and Mary sought no spotlight, nor did they embellish their story for the sake of sensationalism. They simply recounted to investigators the reality of their experience. A craft descending imperceptibly over a serene Essex street, a room infused with light, figures that observed them without physical interaction, and a perplexing gap in time that returned them to their driveway without understanding how. What endures is a singular moment suspended in their memories, a tranquil night, an unseen object, a beam of light, and an encounter that ingrained itself into their lives, leaving an array of questions in its wake. The Quantocks Phantom helicopter pursuit in 1977 paints a picture of the same eerie mystery. The hills of the Quantocks remained dark and undisturbed on the night of March 11, 1977. The narrow roads weaving through the Somerset countryside lay largely vacant, illuminated only by the sporadic glow of farmhouse windows and the soft amber warmth of distant village lamps. An early spring chill clung to the hedge in the cool air. Fields flanking the lane melted into the surrounding blackness, disrupted only by clusters of wind-shaped trees which stood stoically against the brilliant expanse of the sky. Shortly after 10 p.m., a man named David Harper was driving home toward Nether Stowey following a late shift in Bridgewater. His small saloon hummed steadily down the twisting road, headlights painting white arcs across the hedges. Familiar with the route, he anticipated nothing more captivating than a fox darting across the road or a pheasant taking flight from the roadside. The tranquility of the Quantocks at night was a cherished aspect for him. Yet, as he rounded a gentle curve, a light appeared in the sky ahead, heralding the onset of an experience unlike any he had ever known. It was too low to be a star, yet too radiant for a farmhouse lamp. His immediate assumption was that it might be a helicopter, unusually close to the terrain. Gradually decreasing his speed, he awaited the familiar thrum of rotating blades. Silence enveloped him. He partially rolled down his window, anticipating the wind to carry any sound. Still, nothing broke the stillness. The light maintained a steady presence, tracing a slow, deliberate path above the road. He carried on driving, a sense of unease creeping in but not yet escalating to fear. As the object descended slightly, it kept pace with his vehicle. The illumination was white, sharply defined, and outshone any spotlight from an aircraft he had encountered previously. Beneath it, the beam methodically scanned the earth. It swept across the road, traversed the fields, and returned in a smooth motion. David felt a sudden prickling sensation on his skin. The meticulous manner in which the beam moved compelled him to clutch the steering wheel with increasing intensity. When the light dipped closer, mere dozens of feet above the ground, an undeniable wave of apprehension washed over him. Helicopters simply did not fly this low along these winding roads after dark. Leaning forward, he endeavored to glimpse the silhouette of the craft obscured by the light. No tail, no rotor, no discernible structure, only the glaring white beam and an indistinct mass behind it. The silence weighed heavy in the air. If it were a helicopter, it was one that produced no audible evidence of its presence. The beam swept over his car, momentarily flooding the interior with harsh luminosity. The light was potent enough that he could feel its warmth filter through the glass. His radio crackled to life with static, a burst of distortion roiling the speakers before abruptly retreating. The atmosphere inside the car felt electric, reminiscent of that petrifying moment preceding a lightning strike, a pressure suspending in the air, begging for explanation. He pressed down on the accelerator, yearning to create distance between himself and the enigmatic object. As he quickened his pace, the light effortlessly matched his speed, gliding along the asphalt in eerie quietude. The beam shifted with uncanny precision, tracking him unwaveringly. There was no oscillation, no turbulence, nothing to suggest the craft was contending with the evening breeze. In a sudden bid to outmaneuver it, he veered sharply toward Holford, seeking refuge behind the trees. Yet, the object synchronized flawlessly with his turn, remaining above the road as if tethered to his movements. His breath quickened. He attempted the radio once more, but it only hissed and crackled, punctuated by intermittent bursts of noise. He decided to silence the device. Moments later, an unusual phenomenon occurred. David experienced a pressure within his thoughts, akin to a small intrusive pulse, a sensation entirely distinct from fear or adrenaline. It lasted but a fleeting moment, yet it gripped him so captivatingly that he nearly decelerated the vehicle. Later, he would depict it as though someone were casting a thought toward him silently. There were no words, no message conveyed, only a transient focus of attention that felt distinctly external. Then, as swiftly as it had come, it vanished. Initially, he refrained from disclosing this detail to investigators, deeming it too peculiar, too intimate, as though it might undermine his credibility. Months hence, he confessed it, having learned that others nearby reported similar sensations during otherworldly aerial encounters that same year. Turning once more, he navigated onto a narrow lane that plunged deeper into the hills. The object followed suit, lowering itself so that the beam illuminated the hedges directly. The brightness transformed the narrow lane into what resembled daylight. David's vulnerability was palpable. It felt not like a pursuit, but rather as if the object were scrutinizing him. A sensation he could not articulate settled within his chest. Suddenly, the beam shifted and ascended. The craft soared with astoundingly smooth grace, drifting to the right over an open field. It hovered above the grass for several heartbeats, casting its light across the area with meticulous scrutiny. He observed from his position on the lane, torn between the instinct to retreat or to halt completely. The light remained steadfast, only to manifest something that amplified his disquiet. The craft seamlessly executed a backward movement, not angling, not curving, merely retracing its own path with the same deliberate precision, all without sound. Aircraft were not capable of maneuvering in such a way. As he watched it glide back along the original trajectory, a chilling realization began to settle in. Whatever it was, it behaved in defiance of any aircraft behavior he was accustomed to. When it reached the altitude above the road where he had first encountered it, the object halted. The light grew dimmer, and after a moment, the craft tilted slightly, rotating upon its axis. It ascended vertically this time, gaining altitude faster, seamlessly climbing into the night until the brilliance transformed into a mere faint dot overhead. Within moments, the dot flickered before disappearing altogether. David remained seated in his car for an agonizing interval, breathing heavily. The night reclaimed its normalcy. The hedges stood undisturbed, the air reverted to its customary quality. He turned the ignition and navigated the remainder of the journey home, glancing into the rearview mirror repeatedly. The following morning, he reported the sighting. The police recorded his statement with measured neutrality, though one officer mentioned that recent reports from the area had emerged regarding unusual lights in the night. Several farmers spoke of a low, hovering object observing their fields. One farmer recounted his cattle acting peculiarly, while another mentioned a faint humming sound one evening, following which his dog refused to leave the yard. These accounts were disparate and garnered little credibility until David's corroboration came forth. Just 2 days later, additional reports surfaced. A couple strolling near Quant Ridge on that same night recounted witnessing a brilliant light gliding silently overhead. They noted it moved with too much steadiness to be a plane and too slowly to be a helicopter. The light altered its course without banking. They described the silence accompanying it as profoundly unnatural. A gentleman residing in East Quantox claimed he spotted a beam of light sweeping across the fields near his home, despite no helicopter being scheduled in the vicinity that evening. An RAF spokesperson affirmed that no military aircraft were operating at low altitudes over the Quantox that evening, nor were any training exercises taking place. There was an absence of reported incidents involving malfunctioning aircraft or unexpected flights. A summary was submitted to the Ministry of Defense, yet no follow-up inquiries were initiated. With no radar validation to support the claims, the occurrence was recorded and quietly closed. For David, the ramifications endured. He expressed feeling under scrutiny for several nights following the incident, recalling a moment when he awakened to an unusual intensity of brightness in his bedroom, despite the curtains being drawn and no apparent light source. The luminescence diminished rapidly, vanishing almost as abruptly as it had appeared. On another occasion, he awoke with a sudden, overwhelming pressure in his chest, a sensation so reminiscent of the moment the light beam struck his vehicle that it felt surreal. He experienced an intrusion in his thoughts, reminiscent of the disconcerting pulse that had suddenly overwhelmed him while driving. The sensation was transient, yet potent enough to bolt him upright in bed, heart racing. He never posited that he had been abducted, nor claimed any form of communication, yet he consistently asserted that the mental pressure he felt was unequivocally real. To him, it seemed as though something briefly reached out, probing and assessing him. He did not purport to comprehend it fully. In the months that ensued, more reports surfaced from the Quant. Witnesses spoke of silent lights gliding low across the hills, beams roving through fields, and objects abruptly changing course without sound. The so-called phantom helicopter sightings escalated to such a degree that local newspapers began publishing brief articles about the bizarre lights, though there was no direct attribution of these events to David's experience. Investigators revisiting the case years later identified it as aligning with a pattern of silent aerial phenomena observed across Britain in the late 1970s. Reports encapsulated low-altitude motions, ground-scanning beams, and extraordinary maneuverability, all interspersed with intrusions into thought or perception. These characteristics were recurrent in documentation from that era. The consistency of David's narrative over the decades did not escape their notice. He remained unyielding in his recollection, refraining from altering facts or adding embellishments. His account was marked by a calm precision and steadiness. He maintained that the most disquieting aspect of the encounter was not the object itself, but rather the silence enveloping it, the way it calmly followed his car, akin to something unhurried and purposeful. It was the manner in which the beam tracked him, as if it were guided by an intention, and the eerie ambiance that remained after it vanished, as if something had extracted itself from the world, leaving the air still unsettled in its wake. The Quant retains its tranquility today, with narrow pathways winding through hedgerows and fields, stretching serenely into the hills. Yet, for those who were raised on tales of the phantom helicopter, the area evokes a hushed nostalgia, a reminder that on one serene night in 1977, something moved above those lanes, making no sound, pursuing a solitary motorist with deliberate intention, and leaving in its wake a lingering disquietude that has yet to fully dissipate from the Somerset Hills. The Hexham Heads and Tall Visitors, 1971 to 1974. Hexham, Northumberland. This quiet town nestled in Northumberland was a place where peculiar stories infrequently emerged. The houses aligned closely along narrow streets, with hills gently rolling in the distance, while the laughter of children playing echoed softly through the neighborhoods after school. In February 1971, an event unfolded in one of those neighborhoods that initially appeared innocuous. Two young brothers, Colin and Leslie Robson, were engaged in digging in the modest garden behind their home on Rita Avenue when they unearthed two carved stone heads. Resembling grapefruits in size, these artifacts were crudely fashioned to depict human faces with exaggerated features and pronounced brows. The boys showcased their peculiar findings to their parents, who placed the heads on the living room mantel as curiosities. No one anticipated that these objects would herald the beginning of one of the strangest sequences of events in British folklore and UFO history. The first disturbance transpired merely a night later, with the family hearing shuffling noises downstairs. Mrs. Robson descended the stairs, anticipating to find the cat engaging in some mischief, but found the room devoid of any presence. Upon waking the next morning, she discovered that furniture had shifted slightly, not enough to imply a break-in, yet enough to heighten her unease. Initially attributing the disturbances to the children, she was met with vehement denials. As the days progressed, the unsettling occurrences intensified. Items within the house seemed to move independently, vases shifting several inches on tables, small objects vanishing only to later reappear in unexpected locations. Eventually, the phenomena escalated to include footsteps. One evening, Colin awoke to the sound of something navigating the hallway. The steps were heavy yet unsteady, as though something unfamiliar with walking was endeavoring to move. Believing it to be his father, Colin called out, yet the footsteps hesitated before resuming their pace. Quieter this time, almost as if they were intentionally trying to remain discreet. When the family searched, they encountered an empty hall, with no one admitting to having moved about the house. Soon, neighboring homes began reporting similar disturbances. A woman just 2 houses down claimed to have seen a figure dart past her back window late at night, describing it as tall and broad-shouldered, moving with peculiar speed. Another neighbor recounted hearing scratching at her back door, followed by a sound resembling something heavy leaning against it. Upon opening the door, she found nothing there. Local newspapers began to cover the unfolding story, prompting 2 paranormal researchers to pay a visit to the Robson household. They noted that the heads felt warm to the touch, contrasting with the chilliness of the room. They also observed the boys' reluctance to hold the objects for any extended period, with both brothers expressing feelings of unease as if they were under scrutiny. After several weeks of escalating disturbances, the family ultimately opted to relinquish the heads to a local academic, Dr. Anne Ross, a specialist in Celtic archaeology, came to the conclusion that the heads might have connections to ancient ceremonial items. She transported them to her home for further examination, placing them carefully in her living room. Dismissing the tales of disruptions, she maintained that the artifacts were nothing more than ordinary stone carvings. However, a mere 3 days later, her perspective shifted dramatically. While she was alone in her bedroom, absorbed in her reading, she became aware of an ominous presence downstairs. The sound of heavy footsteps traversed the living room, leading her to initially assume her daughter had returned unexpectedly. Yet, when she called out, silence greeted her. The sound echoed through the hallway and ascended the stairs. She described the footsteps as being so substantial that they sent vibrations through the floorboards. A sudden shift in the air enveloped her. This was no mere draft, but a significant alteration in the very atmosphere. Before she could process her unease, she perceived it emerging. A towering figure, possessing a broad and muscular physique, filled the doorway of her bedroom. Its body was enveloped in thick, dark hair, reminiscent of an animal, yet standing upright. As it turned its head to face her, the encounter lasted only a fleeting moment before it descended the stairs, its heavy footsteps gradually fading away. Driven by a chilling mix of terror and curiosity, She followed in haste to better comprehend what she had witnessed. Upon reaching the bottom of the staircase, she found the living room deserted. The front door remained locked, and not a single window stood ajar. An enveloping silence reigned over the house. Doctor. Ross later recounted that the creature seemed acutely aware of her presence, and the air surrounding it felt dense, charged with unknown energy. Convinced that the heads had stirred something sinister, she promptly returned them to the Robson family, eager to disassociate herself from their troubling influence. Nevertheless, the spate of disturbances persisted. The location of these strange phenomena continued to shift after the heads were acquired by yet another researcher, Mr. Don Robbins. Close to his garden, several neighbors began reporting sightings of a markedly different entity. This being was described as tall, thin, and deeply pale, distinctly human-shaped, yet with elongated features. One witness articulated that its eyes had an unusual brightness, reflective pale blue, striking enough to capture even the faintest glimmers of light. Another individual recounted an experience of the figure standing immobile beside her shed, its gaze penetrating, although she sensed its presence more within her mind than through direct observation. A man residing several streets away recounted waking in the night to find a tall form stationed at the foot of his bed. Paralyzed by fear, he was unable to move or call out. The figure's eyes appeared to emanate a soft glow in the darkness. He described the ambiance of the room as saturated with a quiet hum, a vibration that pressed against his skull. Upon eventually managing to blink, he discovered the figure had vanished. Although these sightings seemed to bear no relation to the initial hairy apparition encountered by Dr. Ross, investigators later noted that tall, pale humanoids with bright or blue eyes had been reported in various British UFO occurrences from the early 1970s. The Hexam accounts shared unsettling similarities with these patterns. The most disturbing account emerged from a neighbor situated behind the Robson residence. Awakening to find a tall, pale figure lurking outside her back window, she described its eyes as unnaturally brilliant, reflecting moonlight with a glassy sheen. A wave of intrusion swept over her, as if she sensed a profound penetration of her thoughts. For several moments she found herself unable to move or utter a sound. When the figure finally retreated, it did so with an eerily fluid motion, a grace that belied human movement. The following day, she discovered impressions in the soft earth adjacent to her garden gate. These did not resemble typical footprints. Instead, they appeared as deep, round depressions, suggesting that something heavy had stood there, despite the slenderness of the figure she had glimpsed. In the aftermath of these sightings, the Hexam heads were subjected to official examination. They changed hands numerous times among academics, and bizarre occurrences seemed to follow them relentlessly. Within one university storage room, books toppled from their shelves overnight in unnaturally straight lines. In another instance, a staff member reported experiencing a sudden chill, followed by the fleeting sight of a tall figure passing the hallway's end, although he was alone in the building at the time. Then, the heads mysteriously vanished. During their attempted transport to a different facility, both artifacts disappeared without a trace. No documentation exists regarding who last had possession of them. While one researcher asserted that the heads had been securely packed, another maintained they never arrived. This disappearance only served to deepen the enigma. With the objects gone, the disturbances gradually subsided. The sightings of entities diminished as well, allowing the neighborhood to regain its former tranquility. Yet the witnesses remained haunted by their memories. Years later, the Robson boys, now grown men, expressed a lingering belief that the heads carried with them an otherworldly essence, something profoundly incompatible with a family environment. They thought the disturbances and sightings were intertwined with the artifacts, despite their inability to articulate the connection. Dr. Ross upheld her account of the hairy creature until her passing, asserting that the heads had awakened or summoned an entity, a presence that departed as swiftly as the objects themselves. The witnesses who glimpsed the tall blue-eyed figure spoke sparingly about their experiences, attesting to a sense of mental intrusion and a subtle pressure within their thoughts. They did not ascribe the figure to folklore or conventional ghost narratives. Instead, they posited it was something entirely unique, something conscious, something intentionally present. Later investigations assessing the case noted that such sightings of tall, pale humanoids with luminous eyes often coincided with regional UFO phenomena. Northumberland in the early 1970s had documented numerous reports of silent lights traversing the moors, objects ascending vertically without sound, and encounters characterized by abrupt paralysis or lapses in memory. The Hexham Head seemed inexorably tied to these mysterious occurrences, to act as a catalyst, drawing activity toward a concentrated geographic area. The case stands as one of the most peculiar amalgamations of folklore, archaeology, and close encounter phenomena ever chronicled in Britain. It occupies a unique intersection where ancient artifacts, sightings of entities, and cognitive intrusions converge. The cause of the disturbances remains elusive. No one has definitively determined whether the heads incited these events, were themselves drawn to them, or if their connection is merely coincidental. The indistinct creature observed by Dr. Ross and the tall, pale figures reported in the vicinity stand apart yet share an uncanny bond through both time and space. What remains today are narratives that feel composed and coherent when articulated, as if the witnesses have learned to harbor their memories with quiet resolve. The garden where the Robson boys unearthed the heads appears ordinary now. The homes along Reed Avenue have changed hands several times over the years. The fields behind the Robbins house still host the same hedges and trees, yet the air is thick with lingering tales, heavy footsteps echoing in empty hallways. Glowing blue eyes peering from the shadows, objects inexplicably vanishing and reappearing. An aura of presence that seemed to drape over Hexham for several years, only to dissipate abruptly when the artifacts vanished. The Hexham Heads case persists because it evades a singular explanation. It forges a connection between folklore and encounters of the fourth kind, leaving behind a sequence of events that defy neat categorization. Something traversed those streets during the early 1970s, something tall, something pallid, something aware. And as the objects believed to anchor the disturbances disappeared, so too did the presence, evaporating with them, leaving only the recollections that the witnesses still narrate with a consistent, subdued unease decades later. The Winter Hill Triangular Intruder, 1999, Winter Hill, Lancashire. Winter Hill has always exuded a solitary ambiance. The stretch of moorland rising between Lancashire and Greater Manchester is the kind of landscape where sound carries in peculiar ways, and the wind seems to nestle into the ground rather than whip through the air. The television masts loom over the terrain like silent metallic sentinels, their red lights pulsing steadily against the night. On most evenings, the area takes on an empty and remote quality, even when nearby towns flicker faintly in the distance. On the evening of October 4th, 1999, the air hung unusually still. The temperature had plummeted swiftly after sunset, leaving wisps of mist curling along the lower slopes. Two hikers, Martin and Angela, were making their descent from the ridge, having lingered longer at the summit than initially intended. The clock was nearing 8 o'clock, and the last traces of daylight had slipped behind the horizon. While they were seasoned enough to feel at ease on the hill after dark, both later reflected on a peculiar quality to the night. It felt too hushed. No wind stirred the heather, no distant murmur from the masts. Even their footfalls seemed muted. They were halfway down when they first detected the light. Emerging low on the horizon near the trees at the hill's base, it appeared at first as a pale white point, moving too languidly to be an aircraft and too consistently to be a car navigating one of the twisting roads. They halted to observe it, anticipating its ascent or disappearance behind the trees. Instead, it climbed silently, without flicker, until it reached a position just above the treetops. The light remained suspended there, unyielding. The silence that enveloped them grew more profound. They continued their descent cautiously, their gazes riveted on the object. As they proceeded, the light shifted. It did not glide sideways like a helicopter or plane. It moved perfectly horizontally toward the slope of the hill, maintaining its altitude as it advanced. As soon as it cleared the treetop line, another light materialized beside it, followed by a third, the three forming a perfect triangle. Martin and Angela froze in place. The triangle expanded as it neared the ridge. The shape nestled between the lights became discernible, a massive dark form that obscured the stars behind it. The underside of the craft absorbed the faint moonlight rather than reflecting it, appearing as a near-perfect black. When the craft came to a halt, the air surrounding them felt oppressive. Angela noted a pressure in her throat, as though the atmosphere had thickened. Martin sensed a low humming vibration in his chest. It was not a sound, but rather a resonance coursing through him. The craft hovered a scant 100 feet above the slope. Its dimensions were difficult to gauge precisely, yet both estimated it to be larger than a commercial airliner. Its edges were defined and sharp. The lights at each vertex pulsed with a soft glow, not flashing, but rather inhaling and exhaling in slow, measured intervals. Once again, there was no sound. Even the distant lights from Bolton and Clay appeared dimmer. For several agonizing seconds, they stood transfixed. Their minds struggled to comprehend the enormity of what lay before them. The craft tilted subtly, adjusting its alignment. As it did so, a beam of pale light emerged from its underside. Unlike the scatter of a helicopter spotlight, this beam remained perfectly cylindrical, piercing the air like a column of luminous mist. It swept across the slope with purposeful precision. Martin felt the pressure in his chest intensify as the beam passed their position. Angela experienced something altogether different. She later articulated that when the light brushed against her, a wave of profound calm washed over her, though it coexisted with a sensation she could scarcely articulate. It was neither peace nor fear, but the sensation of being seen from within. A mental presence grazed her thoughts gently. The beam slowly shifted, scanning the valley below. As it moved, the craft again tilted, responding almost instantaneously to the alteration in direction. The motion was fluid, mechanical, and exceedingly precise, too refined to resemble anything crafted through conventional aviation methods. The craft made no sound, no low thrum, no rush of wind. It seemed as if the imposing triangular structure hovered within a vacuum. Angela cautiously stepped back. The instant her foot moved, the craft responded. One of the corner lights flared to life, a soft illumination brightening just slightly. The beam focused, its diameter tightening. The craft lowered a few feet, its descent seamless and deliberate. Martin grasped her arm, acutely aware that any abrupt motion felt entirely out of place. They stood frozen, transfixed. The beam swept across them once more. A vibration surged within Martin's chest, rising to the base of his throat. Angela gazed upward, entranced and unable to divert her gaze from the craft. She suddenly felt a jarring intrusion into her consciousness, a quick flash of stark white space accompanied by distant, resounding echoes. It was but a fleeting moment, lasting less than a second, yet it left her gasping for air. She refrained from immediately revealing it to Martin. No words seemed adequate to convey what had just transpired. The triangular entity began to rotate slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if scrutinizing the slope beneath it. Then, an unexplainable phenomenon unfolded, evading rational explanation. The ground below them glowed faintly, even though the beam no longer targeted their position. The heather shimmered subtly. The atmosphere felt charged, electric, as though the air were on the cusp of a thunderclap. Angela sensed a dullness descending over her mind, her thoughts slowing and thickening. Martin experienced a fleeting sensation of weightlessness, only to be quickly followed by an unexpected heaviness in his limbs. Both of them described a peculiar experience of being ensnared in a moment that stretched far beyond the confines of normal time. And then, the craft ascended. The movement was abrupt but eerily silent. The pressure in the air dissipated in an instant. The beam retracted, coiling inwards like thread drawn into a spool. The triangle shot upward, rising straight with a smoothness that made the motion feel otherworldly. It climbed rapidly enough that the lights transformed into mere pinpricks within seconds. It did not fade into the expanse of the sky. It vanished. The lights extinguished simultaneously as if someone had abruptly severed their power source. One moment the craft occupied space, the next, the vast sky held no trace of its existence. Martin and Angela stood in silence on the slope, their breathing heavy, waiting for sound to return. Their ears rang softly. When they finally broke the stillness, their voices sounded distant, almost fragile. Angela became aware of her trembling hands. Martin felt an unusual tingling in his fingertips that lingered for several minutes. They meandered down the hill slowly, glancing upwards repeatedly. The mist had once again settled, and the night appeared normal, as though nothing had occurred. Upon reaching their vehicle, Angela realized her watch had stopped. It displayed 7:58 p.m., even though she was certain the incident had extended well past 8. Martin checked his watch too. It indicated a completely different time. 20 minutes had slipped away, a span neither could fully account for. They endeavored to reconstruct the incident, yet each struggled to recall the precise sequence of the craft's departure. The memory felt obscured, as if portions of it had been unintentionally pushed just beyond their grasp. They drove home, enveloped in silence. The following morning, they approached the police. The officer who took their statement listened attentively, but made no official record. They reached out to Manchester Airport and Liverpool John Lennon Airport, neither of which reported any aircraft over Winter Hill during that time frame. No helicopters, no military flights, no air ambulances were logged. The radar records showed nothing. They consulted with a local group of UFO investigators who documented their experience meticulously. When interviewed separately, both recounted identical movements, the same lights, and the shared sensation of pressure in the air. Angela hesitated before mentioning the intrusive flash she had experienced, feeling a twinge of embarrassment in her subsequent interview. The investigator who recorded her account noted that similar details surfaced in many triangle encounters across the United Kingdom during the late 1990s. Reports of other similar sightings soon trickled in. A motorist on the A673 claimed he had spotted a massive triangular object hovering low over the moor that same night, describing the corner lights and the same silent movement. A family in Horwich reported witnessing a bright white beam scanning the hillside around 8:20 p.m. A farmer near Belmont shared that his livestock had been unusually agitated that evening, congregating at one end of his field for no discernible reason. He mentioned hearing a faint hum in the distance, unable to determine from which direction it came. Over the following week, several hikers reported encountering peculiar lights near the summit. 2 teenagers asserted that a triangular craft had glided overhead without producing a sound, low enough for them to feel a vibration resonating within their bodies. A woman walking her dog near the television mast observed a slowly drifting object cross the ridge, vanishing abruptly. She confessed that the silence surrounding the event startled her most. Investigators who reviewed the compiled reports noted striking commonalities. These encompassed silent flight, a triangular shape, bright white corner lights, a ground-scanning beam, sudden disappearance, lost minutes, mental intrusion, and physical sensations in the chest or throat, with animals evincing avoidance. Such patterns remained consistent not only within the context of Winter Hill, but also among numerous triangular sightings across Britain between 1995 and 2001. The Winter Hill incident evolved into one of the most thoroughly documented occurrences from that wave, thanks to the clarity of the witnesses and the geography of their encounter. The hill served as a dark backdrop against which the shape of the craft became unmistakably clear. For Martin and Angela, the event quietly persisted in their minds. In the months that followed, Angela found herself haunted by recurrent dreams. In these dreams, she stood upon the slope, gazing up at the triangle hovering above her. Yet in her dreams, the sky appeared white instead of black, accompanied by a pervasive feeling of being pulled within her thoughts. She awoke from these dreams disoriented, struggling to recall her surroundings. These dreams gradually faded from her memory, though they never entirely dissipated. Martin frequently returned to the hill, retracing the same path multiple times a year. He remarked on the familiar warmth that enveloped him upon reaching the very spot where the craft had once hovered. The air held a distinct quality in that place, though he confessed it might have stemmed from his own imagination. He oftentimes felt an unseen gaze upon him while standing on the slope, laughter escaping him as he shared this sentiment, almost as if he sought to lighten the weight of the notion. The Winter Hill Triangular Intruder is acknowledged as one of the most vivid triangular craft sightings at close range in the United Kingdom. It occupies a unique space among such encounters, typically characterized by profound silence, precision, and moments that subtly infiltrate one's perception. A craft, comparable in size to an aircraft, hovered without a sound. A beam of light scanned the ground with unwavering focus, enveloping everything within its reach. The air felt laden with an unusual pressure. The sensation of weightlessness interspersed with snippets of lost time accompanied a presence that seemed intent and deliberate. Winter Hill continues to rise with quiet dignity above the Lancaster landscape, its masts containing a steady blink that punctuates the night. The wind, persistent as it is, glides over the slope still. Yet, for the two hikers who descended the hill that October evening, the location is indelibly marked by a memory that lingers. It is a memory of something immense and silent that descended into their world, scrutinizing them briefly and then vanishing without a trace, as if it slipped between realities, evading the grasp of conventional existence. In August 1965, the Felixstowe coastline presented an air of serene stillness that settled in like a whisper of twilight. The beaches, lined with shingle, retained the warmth of day for a time before surrendering it to the encroaching night, with the gentle rhythm of waves caressing the stones, providing the only solace as evening deepened. On the night of the 14th of August, the stretch of beach from Felixstowe Ferry to Trimley Marshes felt desolate. The tide hovered low, the air carrying a coolness that bespoke the time of year, while the faint glow from the nearby harbor lights gently brushed the water's surface. Around the hour of 10, two teenagers, both aged 16, wandered along the shingle after departing from a cafe near the waterfront. They were making their way home, traversing the beach as they had done numerous times before. The tide produced soft clicking sounds as small waves ebbed and flowed, and the ambiance felt oddly tranquil. Engaged in low conversation, their words seemed to dissipate into the vastness of the open air. When they had advanced halfway across the beach, one of them paused. He believed he discerned something emanating from the water, not a splash or a wave, but rather a faint metallic sound, akin to two pieces of metal gently clashing. He turned his gaze toward the shoreline, anticipating the sight of a returning boat, or perhaps a fishing line being reeled in. Instead, a pale silhouette emerged slowly from the water. Initially appearing to be a man rising from the shallows, the proportions were decidedly off. The figure was towering, far exceeding their expectations, and its movements possessed an uncanny fluidity. Water streamed off its body in long, unbroken sheets, as if its surface repelled moisture. At first glance, its head bore no discernible features, reflecting the moonlight in a subtle, muted sheen. As it reached the shore, the air around them shifted. A faint static charge enveloped their skin, reminiscent of the sensation preceding a storm. The figure approached the shoreline and halted, motionless, half cloaked in shadow and half bathed in the gentle glow of the moon. One of the boys murmured a suggestion that it might be a diver. However, even as he articulated this thought, he recognized it did not appear to fit that description. There were no tanks, no fins, and certainly no discernible equipment. The shape exuded a stark cleanliness, an almost geometric symmetry. The figure tipped its head slightly, the movement subtle, precise, and distinctly intentional, as if acknowledging their presence. Both boys remained frozen in place, now able to discern greater detail. The head had a smooth, rounded surface, evoking a helmet-like appearance. The form appeared human-like, yet was marked by an aberrant morphology, elongated limbs and a slender torso. The outer layer of this suit, if it was indeed a suit, reflected faint highlights of blue wherever the moonlight kissed it. For nearly 10 seconds, the entity remained still. Then, unexpectedly, a bright glimmer manifested in the sky above the sea, several hundred feet offshore. The boys instinctively turned to observe it. Upon glancing back at the shoreline, the figure had vanished without a trace. They registered no footsteps, no splash, no rustle of stones. It had disappeared silently. Before they could fully grasp the sudden absence, the glowing object in the heavens began to drift. It moved deliberately towards the shoreline, gradually descending until it hovered just above the water's surface. The light surrounding it intensified, casting illumination over the waves below. The boys experienced a heightened pressure in the air once more, this time more palpable. One recounted the sensation of being gently drawn forward, a soft yet insistent pull behind his eyes. He blinked hard, and the feeling abated. A sudden gust of wind swept across the beach. The oval shape of light dimmed sharply before accelerating upward into the sky at a velocity that left no trace behind. It vanished in less than a second. The boys took flight, not daring to glance back until they reached the road. Their lungs burned, and their feet stumbled over the uneven shingle, remaining silent until they reached the glow of a streetlight. Even then, the initial exchange of words emerged haltingly, thinly threaded with trepidation. Without hesitation, they resolved not to confide in their parents about the encounter that evening. Both boys trembled, despite the air not being sufficiently cold to warrant such a reaction. The following morning, they visited the local police station, where their accounts were gathered separately. Each described the same figure, the same light, and the identical pressure in the atmosphere. The officer recorded their observations, but jotted a note in the margin suggesting a likely misidentification. Nevertheless, he forwarded the essential details to the local Coast Guard, who conducted a cursory search of the shoreline. No diving gear, suits, or unusual remnants were uncovered. Unknown to the boys, earlier that evening, around 9, an RAF crew navigating over the Orford Nest testing range reported observing an oval white light moving against the wind at a low altitude. The sighting was officially documented, yet did not warrant further inquiry. Two fishermen, positioned several miles to the north, later reported having observed a radiant object suspended above the water on the same evening, although they delayed their report by several weeks. The boys endeavored to dismiss the incident from their minds, but the ramifications lingered. One experienced a peculiar ringing in his ears lasting several days, while another felt a sensation akin to someone gently tapping the interior of his skull whenever the thought of the figure crossed his mind. A physician examined both boys and discovered no discernible issue. 3 nights later, a different witness stepped forward, a middle-aged man leisurely walking his dog along the identical stretch of coast. He recounted having seen a figure stationed at the shoreline, describing it as tall and pale, its surface reflecting the moonlight. Upon nearing the figure, he perceived a sudden drop in temperature, accompanied by the unsettling sensation that something was softly pressing against the back of his consciousness, as if discouraging him from advancing closer. His dog, sensing something amiss, resisted by pulling back on the leash and whined sharply. When he diverted his gaze momentarily to comfort the dog, the figure vanished. He didn't notice any light in the sky, but he conveyed an impression that the air was charged with energy. The waves behaved oddly, rising and falling irregularly, diverging from the natural tide patterns. His report was rendered quietly, devoid of expectation, yet it lent credence to the boys' experience. In the ensuing week, various local residents disclosed small details. A woman strolling near the marshes indicated she had seen flashes of white light over the estuary just after midnight. An early morning fisherman asserted he had heard a humming sound resonating through the hull of his boat for several seconds. A young couple reported spotting a tall figure near the breakwater at dawn, initially dismissing it as mere trickery of the light until learning about the other witnesses. Subsequent investigations into the case revealed that the 1960s bore witness to numerous peculiar events along the Suffolk coastline, particularly near RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters. Reports of silent lights, low hovering objects over the waters, and fleeting glimpses of figures vanished without trace suggested something was moving quietly along the estuary under the cover of night. The Felixstowe humanoid incident nestled itself within this broader framework. Years later, one of the boys divulged to a researcher his memory of the moment the figure tilted its head. He recounted feeling something then, not a message or a voice, but a fleeting lull in his thoughts, as if an external force had brushed against his mind. This detail had remained unshared with anyone else, causing him embarrassment, yet the sensation never entirely departed. Meanwhile, the other boy endured recurring dreams for several weeks. In these dreams, he found himself at the shoreline once more, witnessing the pale figure emerge from the water. Yet, within the dreamscape, the sea radiated a faint glow, and the surrounding air felt dense and lethargic. He invariably awakened just before the figure could reach him. The investigator who later gathered their statements noted that these symptoms paralleled those described by other fourth witnesses. The static-laden air, the pressure behind the eyes, the sense of a mental intrusion, sudden drops in temperature, and the figure's disappearance without motion, accompanied by an abrupt upward acceleration of the associated light. Nothing about the incident aligned with simple misidentification. No diving gear was unaccounted for, no naval operations were reported in the area on that night, and no atmospheric anomalies could justify the appearance of the pale humanoid silhouette emerging from the water. The Coast Guard recorded the initial police report, but initiated no follow-up investigations. While the Ministry of Defense received a concise summary through internal channels, cases lacking radar verification were typically closed quickly. The RAF pilot's observation from earlier in the evening was never officially correlated with the Felixstowe sighting, despite researchers deeming the timing and description too coincidental to overlook. By the end of August, the sightings ceased. The beach reverted to its ordinary demeanor. The pebbles appeared unchanged. The sound of the waves remained consistent. The tranquility of the Suffolk coastline returned as if nothing extraordinary had transpired. Yet, the witnesses retained their memories. The boys matured yet carried the imprint of that moment with an odd tranquility. They refrained from sharing their tale widely, nor did they seek answers. They simply preserved that moment as a tangible experience that briefly intersected with their lives. A figure rising from the depths of the sea without sound, a luminescent presence hovering above the inky waters. An awareness felt in the charged air. What remains of the Felixstowe humanoid case is a series of occurrences that resonate with a broader pattern manifesting along the English coast during that time. Something navigated those waters. Something silent, something intentional, something capable of manifesting and vanishing without disturbance, something that left behind nothing more than the quiet testimonies of those fortunate enough to witness it. Today, as one stands upon that very beach, the sound of the waves continues to shroud nearly everything. But for those familiar with the narrative, an undercurrent of awareness persists, suggesting the sea harbors secrets far beyond its surface. A recollection of a tall, pale figure emerging from the depths beneath a tranquil Suffolk sky, observed only by two boys who never anticipated becoming the bearers of this story, a story the coastline has never fully relinquished. Moving now to the Hanging Woods, a locality endowed with a subtle notoriety among the denizens of Derbyshire. The trees grew densely together, creating narrow corridors of shadow that remained persistent even under the sunlight, with the ground softening into shallow troughs that filled with mist on frosty evenings. Walkers frequented the footpaths, yet few remained after dusk. Tales of unusual lights and profound silences circulated through the community, the sort of folklore that children half embraced while adults chose to quietly disregard. In the summer of 1993, two hikers ventured into the woods shortly before dusk and stumbled upon a phenomenon neither was equipped to comprehend. Their names were Daniel and Stephen. In their 20s and familiar with the local trails, they had spent the latter part of the afternoon traversing the farthest reaches of the forest, marking small landmarks, tracing the contours of the old quarry lines, and savoring the tranquility of the evening. As they retraced their steps back toward the main path, the light began to wane. An unusual chill invaded the air, creeping in slowly and unsettlingly for a summer night. They sensed it simultaneously, yet neither dared to voice their observations, attributing the shift in temperature to the shadows cast by the dense trees. The quiet thickened around them as they pressed on. Though the woods often dulled sounds, that evening's stillness felt multi-layered, as though every sound had been absorbed by the earth. Their footfalls took on a muted quality. They paused briefly to listen. No birds filled the air, no leaves rustled, no distant roar of traffic broke the silence. Nothing. Daniel remarked in hushed tones that the woods had an unfamiliar quality. Stephen nodded silently, his thoughts aligning with Daniel's own without utterance. Both would later confess they experienced a sudden hesitation, a primal instinct urging them to depart swiftly, even though neither turned back. They followed a narrow trail leading to a small clearing they knew well. This clearing was nestled between two ridges, forming a natural amphitheater where the trees parted just enough to reveal a sliver of sky. Upon entering, they prepared to witness the last fleeting traces of day. Instead, they were greeted by something altogether different. A tall figure stood at the center of the clearing, motionless and turned slightly away. Its frame was slender and elongated, with limbs disproportionately long. The surface of its skin, or whatever material comprised its body, was a pallid gray that seemed to shimmer with the diminishing light. However, the most striking aspect, the one that immediately caught both men's attention, was the face, or more accurately, a mask. Smooth, oval, and reflective, it covered the front of the head, emitting a metallic sheen that distorted the reflections of the surrounding environment. Subtle aberrations within its surface refracted the light, rendering the face both present and elusive. Neither man stirred. The figure remained still. Daniel whispered that it must be a person clad in some eccentric suit. Stephen remained silent, later insisting that even in that moment, he understood the figure was not simply someone indulging in a quirky costume or experiment. The proportions defied logic. The reflective quality of the surface appeared neither as plastic nor metal. There existed a depth to it that was foreign to him. A weight settled heavily in his chest, making his breath feel slightly hindered, as if his lungs were struggling to catch up with the moment. The air surrounding the figure shimmered ever so gently, not in a blatantly warped manner, but in an inherently unsettling way. The thin veil of mist that lingered in the clearing flitted around it, swirling in slow, deliberate loops that disobeyed the evening breeze. Feeling an urge to retreat, Stephen took a tentative step backward. As he did, the figure raised its head. The motion was unnaturally fluid, deliberate, and poised. The reflective mask caught the fading daylight, glinting eerily. In that instant, Daniel sensed a peculiar shift within his mind. A rapid pulse of awareness emerged, foreign and intrusive. He halted mid-breath, and Stephen felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. His knees weakened, not enough to collapse, but significantly enough for him to reach out and brace himself against a nearby tree. The figure turned slightly toward them, and the surface of the face glimmered anew. The reflection cast did not appropriately mirror the clearing. Stephen would later describe it as witnessing the space around him contorting, like peering into an impossible world reflected through a warped mirror. Neither of them recalled consciously choosing to move forward, yet instinctively both took a single involuntary step, as if responding to an unseen invitation. Only when Daniel stumbled slightly did the spell break. The pulse in his mind ceased, and momentarily the burden in his chest lifted. Clutching Stephen's arm, he urged urgently that they must leave. The figure responded. Its head tilted again with a deliberate slow motion that suggested careful observation rather than sheer astonishment. The air thickened once more, the mist swirling. Stephen felt an ephemeral brush against his thoughts, as if testing the boundaries of his consciousness. He heard nothing, yet the sensation of being scrutinized from within sent his heart racing. The figure took a step toward them, moving almost soundlessly, its footfalls barely disturbing the layering of leaves beneath. In that moment, the true height of the figure became evident, at least 7 feet tall, possibly more. Its limbs moved with an unsettling precision, akin to a marionette expertly operated without strings. Daniel felt the pressure in his mind return, intensifying now. He could not discern whether it was fear or some external force gently probing at his thoughts. Again he whispered that they needed to leave. They began to back away cautiously, mindful of the uneven ground beneath their feet. The figure advanced by another step. The mist parted strangely around its legs, exhibiting behaviors unnatural for a summer evening. Daniel's ears rang softly in the silence. Stephen felt a brief void sweep through his mind, an absence of thought lasting no longer than a heartbeat, but leaving him momentarily disoriented. Then, without warning, the ground beneath the figure illuminated faintly. It was not light projected from above. Rather, the glow emanated from the very soil, a soft bluish-white hue that radiated outward for about a foot in every direction. This glow lasted but an instant, yet in that fleeting moment, Stephen felt utterly exposed, as if the figure had peeled back an unseen layer of reality. Grabbing Daniel's arm with urgency, he pulled, and they turned to flee. The silence behind seemed almost sentient. They anticipated the figure to surge forward, to pursue, or to reappear suddenly through the dense trees, yet heard nothing save the sound of their own footsteps, the woods enveloping them in an unnervingly persistent quiet. No snapping twigs, no rustling in the underbrush, no sound of their pursuer. Yet as they fled, they both sensed an unseen watcher. Stephen felt a presence while he ran, not tangible, but rather a mental companion that kept pace with his growing terror, its calmness somehow spurring him to pick up speed. They reached the main trail, slowing only slightly. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and their legs felt as if they were burdened with lead. The forest around them remained strangely quiet as they stumbled into the gravel path. Upon finally emerging from the thicket, the familiar sounds of the countryside rushed back as if to flood the silence abruptly. Crickets chirped, a distant dog barked, and the leaves rustled softly in a gentle breeze. The sudden cacophony startled them, jarring as it was after the eerie quiet they had just endured. Once they reached their car parked in the lay-by, Daniel glanced at his watch. Nearly an hour had slipped away since they had entered the woods, even though to them the encounter felt as though it had scarcely lasted mere minutes. They attempted to piece together the timeline, yet found holes in their memories, brief spans lost between their hurried steps, a minute gone here, another absent there. They chose not to delve deeper into the matter. The next morning, Daniel observed a faint circular mark on the interior of his forearm. It was neither a bruise nor a burn, but rather a patch of skin that appeared subtly lighter than the surrounding area, warm to his touch. It faded after 3 days, just like the lingering unease they both had carried. Meanwhile, Stephen endured headaches for nearly a week, accompanied by fleeting flashes of reflective surfaces just out of sight. Though he brushed these sensations aside initially, he would later confess to an investigator that those flashes felt inexplicably linked to the reflective face. Together, they returned to the clearing a week later. The atmosphere seemed restored to normalcy. Birds flitted freely among the foliage, and mist rolled across the ground in a natural manner, yet something felt off. In the very spot where the figure had loomed, the earth looked disturbed, not as if trampled or dug up, but altered in a mysterious way. A faint circular patch of soil bore a discolored hue, as though it had been lightly singed. The vegetation around it arched away uniformly, as if repelled by an unseen force emanating from a central point. They snapped a photograph of the extraordinary scene, but chose to share the incident with almost no one. Months rolled by before they related their experience to a local researcher dedicated to cataloging paranormal and UFO-related events within Derbyshire. He noted that the reflective face described by both witnesses bore a striking resemblance to several humanoid sightings reported in the surrounding area during the early 1990s. Tall figures with smooth, reflective surfaces, the sensation of mental intrusion, and those peculiar lapses in time along with shifts in atmospheric pressure. He remarked that the Hanging Woods encounter aligned with the patterns he had analyzed more closely than any case in recent years. No report ever reached the Ministry of Defense. There were no radar anomalies, no accounts of lights dancing in the sky, and no tangible evidence aside from that scorched patch. The entire affair gradually faded into a collection of private notes, seldom discussed outside the circles of those familiar with enough strange tales to recognize the details. Daniel and Stephen held on to the memory with a composed calmness. They made no claims of communication. They did not assert abduction. Instead, they simply described the presence as something that momentarily crossed into their reality, scrutinized them, and departed without leaving a trace. Daniel often remarked that the most disconcerting aspect was the peculiar way the figure moved, as if its relationship with gravity and motion operated under different rules. Stephen emphasized the reflective face and how it seemed to warp the world around it in small but inconceivable ways. Hanging Woods appears entirely ordinary today. Hikers traverse its pathways without hesitance. The clearing remains, quiet and open. Yet for those aware of the story, the location carries a stillness that seems to penetrate deeper than the very trunks of the trees themselves. It stands as a testament that on one tranquil evening in 1993, something tall, silent, and silver-faced emerged into a clearing, gazed directly at two hikers, and left behind a memory that resists neat categorization within the reality they once assumed to fully comprehend. Something dwelled in those woods, something sentient, something intentional, leaving in its wake more questions than footprints. To this day, neither witness can stand within that clearing without sensing the faint impression of a moment when their thoughts were not entirely their own. The greater narrative, nonetheless, feels complete. Yet if you wish to linger, several brief tales now await, each rare, ephemeral, and softly relayed. The Phoenix Lights, Arizona, United States, 1997. On March 13, 1997, shortly after 8:00 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, citizens throughout Arizona began calling both law enforcement and television stations. Their reports detailed a formation of silent lights, gliding languidly across the night sky, moving from Henderson, Nevada, toward Phoenix and continuing southward to Tucson. It commenced in the northwest. Witnesses in Henderson, near Las Vegas, observed a colossal object adorned with 6 lights cruising southeast at a low altitude. A police dispatcher documented the initial report at 19:55 Pacific Standard Time, recorded within the Clark County Sheriff's Department incident file labeled 970313-0147. Within moments, accounts from witnesses in Kingman and Prescott Valley began echoing the same spectacle. One former pilot recounted to the Daily Courier that it was not merely one light, but a solid structure, V-shaped, blocking out the stars in its path. By 8:17 p.m., the object traversed into the Phoenix metropolitan airspace, visible from northwest to southeast across a span exceeding 250 miles. The Federal Aviation Administration's Southwest Regional Center in Albuquerque received its first formal inquiry at 20:30, when controllers from Phoenix Sky Harbor reported calls from airline pilots inquiring about unidentified traffic, hovering beneath 10,000 feet. The FAA documented no radar returns within that corridor. Their log entry stated, "No primary or secondary targets detected corresponding to visual reports over the Phoenix area. No IFR or VFR traffic correlated." For the succeeding half hour, observers across the city described an immense triangular or boomerang-shaped object gliding soundlessly across the sky. Some observers positioned the object at 1,500 feet, while others claimed it was at an altitude exceeding 10,000 feet. Yet, there was a remarkable consensus regarding its characteristic 5 to 7 intense amber lights, steady in their glow, devoid of any flickering. At precisely 8:37 p.m., a family residing in Paradise Valley managed to capture on film the lights as they traversed behind the iconic Camelback Mountain, the timestamp clearly marking 20 hours, 37 minutes, and 18 seconds Mountain Standard Time. This sighting aligns with the remarkable volume of calls recorded that evening by the National UFO Reporting Center, known as the UFOC, located in Seattle. Director Peter Davenport meticulously logged over 770 individual reports emanating from Arizona within a 48-hour window. Among the most thorough accounts was that of Dr. Lynn Kitty, a physician from Phoenix, who had been documenting similar aerial formations in the vicinity of South Mountain since 1995. Her footage from the 13th of March, 1997, captured 5 amber orbs in a precise V formation gliding southward. Additionally, both airline and military pilots corroborated the sightings. Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones, serving as a pilot in the Arizona Air National Guard, recounted his experience while approaching Sky Harbor, where he observed a row of lights positioned to the west. These lights appeared uniform and equidistant, distinctly unlike flares or conventional aircraft navigation lights. Subsequent reviews of civil radar data from Sky Harbor, as well as Luke Air Force Base, were conducted by the EFA Wise Western Pacific Division. The official logs from the Phoenix Tron facility, which were declassified in the year 2000 under the Freedom of Information Act, noted no radar correlation and reported no primary target consistent with the movement described by eyewitnesses. Furthermore, there was an absence of any unusual activity detected within controlled airspace. By 8:38 p.m., numerous residents located north of Phoenix recounted seeing the object bank southward just prior to vanishing behind the Sierra Estrella mountain range. Approximately 2 hours later, at 10 o'clock p.m., a second occurrence unfolded. A series of stationary lights became visible high above the Estrellas, seen by thousands throughout the city. This second display was subsequently captured on film by numerous witnesses, including local television stations like KSAZ and KNXV. Initially, the United States Air Force vehemently denied conducting any operations in the area that night. However, 3 months later, Lieutenant Keith Shepard, a spokesperson for Luke Air Force Base, affirmed that, on the night of the 13th of March, a 10 Thunderbolt II aircraft belonging to the 104th Fighter Squadron of the Maryland Air National Guard were engaged in training at the Barry M. Goldwater Range, approximately 60 miles southwest of Phoenix, as part of Operation Snowbird. He stated that the pilots deployed LUU-2BB illumination flares between 9:30 and 10 o'clock p.m. Nevertheless, this explanation only addressed the latter set of stationary lights seen hovering over the mountains, failing to account for the earlier formation spotted at 8 o'clock p.m. that traversed across the entire state. Radar data acquired through the Freedom of Information Act from both the Western Air Defense Sector and NORAD uncovered no tracks that corresponded to any significant aerial formation over Arizona during the time period from 8 o'clock p.m. to 9 o'clock p.m. The NORAD communication summary, released in 2001, affirmed that no evidence of unidentified aircraft was found that matched the reported visual phenomena, and no scrambles were ordered as there were no flight plans that aligned. Despite the lack of radar confirmation, the uniformity of eyewitness accounts captured national interest. The Phoenix Police Force, the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and even Governor F. Symington amassed hundreds of written testimonials. On March 14th, the FAA's Southwest region issued a press statement attributing the lights to civil aircraft flying in formation or possibly to military exercises. Yet, no record of such a formation was logged by any flight service or control tower that night. Initially, Governor Symington, himself a former Air Force pilot, dismissed the sighting during a televised press conference, even orchestrating a mock appearance with a staff member donning an alien costume. However, a decade later, in 2007, he revised his stance, publicly declaring that he had witnessed the event with his own eyes, describing it as enormous and inexplicable. He stated that it was neither flares nor a military aircraft, firmly categorizing it as something beyond conventional aviation. The incident thus divided into 2 distinct verified time frames, the initial event occurring between 8 o'clock p.m. and 8:45 p.m., during which a massive V-shaped craft traversed the state, and the second event around 10 o'clock p.m. that involved stationary lights over the Estrella Mountains. Records from the FAA's radar archives stored at the Albuquerque Air Route Traffic Control Center confirmed the existence of radar gaps beneath 18,000 feet along the Prescott-Phoenix corridor, attributed to the surrounding terrain. This absence of data fails to conclusively establish or negate the presence of an object at a lower altitude. Eyewitness accounts from Prescott Valley, documented by the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, described a sizable silent craft stretching as wide as several football fields. An off-duty airline captain approximated its wingspan at over a mile. Video analyses performed by Dr. Bruce McCabe, a former optical physicist with the United States Navy, suggested that the later formation of lights recorded at 10 o'clock did indeed descend slowly and extinguished in a sequential manner consistent with the drift of flares. However, McCabe also emphasized that the earlier event at 8 o'clock p.m. remained unexplained by the flare hypothesis. The Arizona Republic's front page on June 18, 1997, featured a senior FAA official speaking under the condition of anonymity who declared that there was, without a doubt, something in the sky that night, although the nature of it remained enigmatic. By mid-1998, over 1,600 witness statements had been submitted to the National UFO Reporting Center, the Mutual UFO Network, and the Center for UFO Studies. The descriptions shared across these accounts were strikingly uniform. A massive, silent triangular craft with 5 lights along its leading edge, gliding slowly overhead. The official Air Force Case Review, issued by Lieutenant Colonel David Evans from Luke Air Force Base's Public Affairs, concluded that the only aircraft operating near Phoenix at that time were indeed 10 aircraft conducting night illumination. Training at the Goldwater Range. The flares released around 10 o'clock accounted for the reports of the stationary lights seen to the southwest. No operations were executed in the Phoenix or Prescott area before 20-30 hours. When questioned about the possibility of radar detecting significant objects flying at lower altitudes, Evans acknowledged that it was conceivable a formation below 10,000 feet could escape primary radar detection due to the surrounding landscape. The Air Traffic Evaluation Department of the Federal Aviation Administration noted that the radar tapes from Sky Harbor were routinely overwritten within 15 days, which resulted in the loss of any recoverable data from the 8 o'clock period. By the year 1999, the Black Vault acquired through the Freedom of Information Act the correspondence concerning the incident from March 13th to 14th in 1997. Among the documents were internal memos noting public curiosity about unidentified aerial lights and directives to direct all inquiries to the Public Affairs Division in Washington. The case sustained its presence in both media outlets and formal discussions for several years. In 2001, the National Guard Bureau once more verified that the lights visible at 10 o'clock were indeed flares belonging to the 104th Fighter Squadron. However, they reiterated they were unaware of any activity related to the IO. Earlier occurrence. Then, in 2007, Governor Symington's televised confession reignited national discourse when he stated it was a craft of unknown origin. He described it as larger than anything he ever encountered and characterized its movement as silent and deliberate, leaving an unforgettable impression on all observers. Astronomical checks dismissed Venus, meteors, or the navigation lights of aircraft as possible explanations. Astronomers from the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff confirmed that Venus was not situated at the reported altitude or heading at 8:30 p.m. that very night. In 2012, the National Archives Freedom of Information Act Office disclosed a summary of communications involving NORAD, Air Mobility Command, and the FAA Albuquerque Center. This summary referenced numerous visual accounts of unidentified lights moving across Arizona and southern Nevada between 8 and 8:45 Mountain Standard Time. The summary explicitly mentioned the absence of any military or civilian aircraft correlating with the recorded track. By the 20th anniversary of the event, the file concerning the Phoenix lights had transformed into one of the largest civilian UFO archives globally, consisting of over 10,000 pages of testimonies, radar data, and correspondences from both The FAA and the Air Force preserved in both American and British declassified records. No formal investigation has ever definitively concluded what the initial event entailed. Two essential facts remain indisputable. Hundreds of eyewitnesses observed a structured, silent formation gliding directly over populated regions. No radar signals, military exercises, or astronomical scenarios were found to account for the earlier event occurring at 8:00 p.m. Archived reports labeled unidentified aerial lights are retained by the Phoenix Police Department, the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and the FAA Southwest Regional Office. March 13, 1997. For many, the evening is still a memory filled with quiet wonder. For investigators, however, it persists as one of the clearest mass sightings in contemporary history. Two distinct occurrences were separated by just 2 hours, but only one has found explanation. Phoenix, Arizona, March 13, 1997. A mile-wide formation crosses the desert in silence. The radar remained inactive as pilots stood watch, cameras were rolling, and thousands of witnesses remained with an unanswered question looming above. The Lake Baikal encounters from the 1980s in Lake Baikal, Siberia, Russia, presented conditions where the water was so frigid it felt as if it sliced through the skin. Even in a heavy Soviet wetsuit, divers could experience deep bone aches at a depth nearing 50 meters. Visibility in the lake was unexpectedly remarkable, crystal clear for dozens of meters ahead. Yet, it was not this transparency that astonished them. In the distance, figures floated and were unmistakably humanoid, each reaching an impressive height of approximately 3 meters. They donned smooth, silvery bodysuits that glimmered subtly in the sunlight, piercing through the water's surface. Their movements bore no resemblance to traditional swimming. Rather, they appeared to drift, controlled and deliberate, silently observing. The lead diver squeezed his eyes and adjusted his mask. He was not alone. 6 other Soviet military divers flanked him, all part of a routine training mission directed by the Soviet Navy, and each witnessed the same extraordinary phenomenon. What transpired next would be shrouded in secrecy for decades. Lake Baikal is not an ordinary body of water. It is the largest freshwater lake in the world by volume, with depths surpassing those of the Grand Canyon in certain areas, encircled by the harsh Siberian wilderness. Local lore has long included tales of peculiar lights surfacing from its depths, entire fishing vessels disappearing without a trace, and mysterious beings gliding along the water's surface on moonless nights. However, in the 1980s, amid the heightened tensions of the Cold War, the Soviet military grew increasingly intrigued by the phenomenon. Declassified documents and accounts from former officers revealed that a specialized unit was sent to investigate what had come to be referred to in certain circles as swimmer encounters. Once carefully guarded within military files, these reports eventually surfaced years later due to disclosures by Soviet military officer Major General Vasily Yuramno. Yuramno, assigned to oversee anomalous phenomena for the KGB and Soviet Air Force, later confirmed in interviews that numerous Soviet naval operations had encountered inexplicable underwater activities, particularly in Lake Baikal. The most chilling incident occurred during a training dive in 1982 near the lake's western shoreline. As 7 Navy divers descended in formation, they came face to face with the tall humanoid beings. Startled, the divers endeavored to approach. Orders from the command specified that any unidentified entities were to be captured for examination. However, their mission faltered. As they advanced towards the beings, an unseen force surged through the water. Some likened it to a shock wave, while others spoke of a sudden compression that hurled their bodies backward. In the subsequent chaos, 3 divers became stranded and failed to resurface in time, ultimately losing their lives. The other 4 were left with grave injuries, including decompression sickness, despite not exceeding their diving limits. The incident was swiftly classified. In military records, the official cause of death cited was rapid ascent complications leading to barotrauma. Yet, for those present, the reality was more profound. They had faced an entity beyond the scope of earthly existence, or at the very least, one not of human creation. In the ensuing weeks, the atmosphere surrounding Lake Ball became charged with urgency. Patrol boats scoured the waters under the cover of night, while helicopters executed low-altitude passes over the glimmering surface. Divers, diverted from their usual tasks, were redirected to standby status, yet no subsequent official missions emerged in public discourse. Civilians remained vigilant witnesses, noting peculiar occurrences. In 1987, a local fisherman, Alex Timoshenko, reported observing an ethereal orb ascending from the lake at a late hour. This orb hovered in silence, radiating a bluish luminescence that danced upon the water's surface before launching skyward, devoid of sound or any visible means of propulsion. Simultaneously, a nearby scientific research vessel detected a jarring energy anomaly within their instruments. However, their official log utterly omitted any mention of the unidentified object. The following year, in 1988, residents from the neighboring town of Lisviana beheld multiple fiery orange lights hovering ominously above the lake. Some observers claimed to see these lights darting beneath the surface, an unsettling sight visible from the shore, even through thick layers of ice. A few daring individuals managed to capture photographs, yet those reels mysteriously vanished into the hands of plainclothes operatives within mere days. By 1990, informal confirmations from Russian naval personnel to independent journalists suggested that sonar technology had identified fast-moving objects lurking deep within the lake, traversing at velocities unattainable by current. Submarines, some surpassing 250 kilometers per hour. These unidentified submerged objects, or USOS, exhibited patterns of movement, accelerating both vertically and horizontally, a feat no recognized vessel could execute at such depths. Intriguingly, these contacts appeared and vanished without a traceable origin, lacking a seafloor installation or geological cave systems. Only sudden manifestations, erratic courses, and abrupt disappearances characterized their presence. Initially skeptical, Soviet scientists began amassing environmental data coinciding with the reported sightings. Some readings indicated fleeting bursts of high radiation levels in narrowly defined regions of the lake, only to normalize hours later. The Ministry of Defense maintained a cautious silence, and most local media outlets shied away from discussing the phenomenon altogether. It was only after the dissolution of the Soviet Union that information began to emerge more freely. Researchers in the West, including members of MUF and various independent Russian UFO collectives, began dialogues with retired military officials who had served near Lake Ball. Many confirmed encounters off the record, some implying that directives were established to avoid engagement or interference following the tragic incident in 1982. One retired Soviet naval officer, utilizing the pseudonym Captain Mikhail, recounted experiences while stationed nearby during submarine drills, noting that he witnessed mysterious green lights undulating beneath the surface. These lights moved with a precision that eluded their tracking capabilities. They were not theirs, nor did they belong to anyone else, he affirmed. Even more striking was the remarkable uniformity in these accounts. Over the span of nearly 2 decades, local fishermen, scientists, divers, and military members relayed similar narratives: swiftly gliding lights, humanoid figures swimming gracefully, and soundless craft ascending from the depths. What could they be? Some theorists propose that these beings represented an ancient species, evolved to thrive in the planet's most inaccessible aquatic environments, remaining shrouded from human awareness. Others speculated that they might be extraterrestrials, leveraging Earth's lakes and oceans as covert refugees. A handful of scientists hypothesized that these sightings involved advanced military technology, but no known apparatus, either past or present, could match the agility and silent operation consistently reported. Naturally, skeptics offered explanations grounded in established science: sonar anomalies, underwater gas eruptions, collective hallucinations, even bioluminescent organisms. Nonetheless, none of these theories sufficiently accounted for the convergence of visual sightings, sonar evidence, surges in radiation, and the tragic losses incurred by trained divers. One of the last widely recognized accounts emerged in 2009 when amateur divers exploring the southern reaches of Lake Ball claimed to have witnessed a radiant disk glide silently beneath them. One diver reportedly experienced temporary paralysis following the event. Regrettably, this episode never received formal investigation. To this day, the Russian government has largely chosen to remain reticent regarding the ball phenomena, with no official body assuming responsibility for the documentation or exploration of these mysterious reports. Locals persist in sharing their experiences in whispers. Divers continue to exercise caution in the lake's profoundest depths. Lake Ball retains its stature as one of the most enigmatic bodies of water on the planet, not solely for its age, unusual fauna, or geological marvels, but also for what may still lie hidden within its depths. In a world teeming with surveillance technology and where information travels instantaneously, certain locales remain shrouded in silence. And some mysteries, particularly those submerged beneath ancient icy stillness, seem resolute in safeguarding their secrets. Ellsworth Air Force Base /B-52, Encounter 1953. On a balmy summer night in 1953, the serene expanse of the South Dakota prairie resonated with the subdued, steady rumble of bombers departing from Ellsworth Air Force Base. Situated near Rapid City, this base was among the key installations for the United States during the early Cold War era. From here, Strategic Air Command aircraft prepared for extensive missions, while radar teams maintained an unyielding vigil over the northern skies. The operation was habitual, disciplined, and altogether familiar. Yet, on this particular night, a crew aboard a B-52 bomber, in conjunction with radar operators and base staff, found themselves embroiled in an encounter that defied the ordinary. This event would subsequently be cataloged in Project Blue Book as one of its persistent radar visual enigmas. The episode unfolded just prior to midnight as the B-52, engaged in a training flight above South Dakota, detected an unusual radar signal. Initially, the crew presumed the blip might indicate another aircraft, but its movement was decidedly erratic. It zipped swiftly across the radar screen, momentarily halting before surging forward again at remarkable velocity. The pilot, a veteran officer of the Air Force, reached out to the ground controllers at Ellsworth for confirmation about any nearby aircraft. The response was negative. Yet mere minutes later, Ellsworth's ground radar corroborated the crew's observations, detecting the same object. Controllers validated what the aircrew had already witnessed, a substantial target exhibiting extraordinary maneuvers. Soon enough, they visually discerned it too. Emerging from the shadows, a brilliant oval-shaped entity was clearly parallel to the bomber's trajectory. It appeared to trail them closely, maintaining a consistent distance, yet it was undeniably visible against the night sky. The luminous object emitted a steady glow, neither flickering like a distant star or planet. At intervals, it seemed to pulse gently, as though powered by some hidden energy emanating from its surface. In an attempt to close the distance, the pilot maneuvered the B-52, but each time, the object reacted instantaneously, accelerating effortlessly to keep its lead. The bomber's crew later likened the experience to a game of tag, where they felt hopelessly outmatched. On the ground, radar operators at Ellsworth were closely monitoring the same erratic movements. The object's sudden shifts and bursts of speed were not mere illusions. They were captured as robust radar returns. Controllers chronicled the blip darting across the display, only to disappear before promptly reappearing miles away. As the incident progressed, additional personnel stationed at Ellsworth stepped outside to observe the phenomenon. Numerous guards reported sighting a glowing object traversing the sky with unparalleled agility. Their descriptions aligned perfectly with those given by the B-52 crew and the radar operators. The encounter persisted for nearly 30 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had materialized, the object launched vertically at phenomenal speed, disappearing from both visual sight and radar detection. The skies above South Dakota fell quiet once more, leaving the bomber crew and ground controllers feeling unsettled and perplexed. In the subsequent days, meticulously detailed reports were compiled. The B-52 crew characterized the object as constructed, radiant, and evidently under intelligent control. Radar logs from both the aircraft and the base corroborated the existence of a solid target, showcasing aerodynamics that defied conventional aircraft capabilities. Ground witnesses confirmed the visual accounts. When Project Blue Book investigators arrived, they meticulously collected testimonies and scrutinized the radar data. The consistency among the reports rendered the case challenging to dismiss. Pilots, radar personnel, and ground observers had all concurrently detailed the same unusual object within the same geographic area. Nevertheless, Blue Book sought explanations. Analysts proposed that atmospheric phenomena, like anomalous radar signal propagation caused by temperature inversions, were to blame. They postulated that the crew and the ground observers might have misidentified celestial bodies distorted by atmospheric conditions. Yet, these hypotheses faltered against the solid accounts provided. Seasoned pilots, trained in celestial navigation, did not err in confusing stars with glowing mobile entities. Radar operators equipped with expertise in recognizing false returns remained convinced that the object's maneuvers were genuine, rather than artifacts of the atmosphere. Ultimately, Blue Book discreetly recorded the case as unidentified. It became one of many incidents with evidence too compelling to dismiss, yet too politically sensitive for public acknowledgement. For the B-52 crew, the memory was enduring. They had confronted an entity that not only surpassed the speed of their bomber, but also evaded all efforts to close the gap, demonstrating an intelligence and control beyond any known technology. The Ellsworth encounter was far from an isolated event. Through the 1950s and 60s, numerous UFO reports surfaced near strategic air command installations and nuclear facilities. Minot, Malmstrom, and other northern bases logged comparable sightings, glowing objects that were captured on radar, trailing bombers, and lingering above missile sites. Some researchers argue that these incidents hinted at a targeted interest in America's nuclear capabilities. Civilian investigators later positioned the Ellsworth case as one of Blue Book's most notable entries, as it amalgamated diverse data sources, radar, visual sightings, ground witnesses, and airborne observations, yet lacked a satisfactory explanation. For NICAP and other investigative groups, it became evident that the Air Force tended to downplay significant encounters. Skeptics, as is customary, presented alternative explanations. Some contended that meteors, capable of generating bright lights and radar signals, were to blame. Others suggested misidentifications of aircraft lights, although it was evident that meteors do not hover, track bombers, or reappear in the same vicinity after vanishing. Clearly, aircraft lights could not account for radar returns reflecting speeds reaching thousands of miles per hour. For those who endured the encounter, certainty prevailed. They had been tailed by something extraordinary over the expanses of South Dakota, an entity that exhibited capabilities far beyond the realm of human engineering. The Ellsworth B-52 incident encapsulates the broader tension surrounding Project Blue Book. Cases such as this, well-documented multi-witness radar visual events, were discreetly acknowledged yet seldom publicized, filed as unidentified. The Air Force preferred to emphasize the majority of sightings it could rationalize. In this manner, it obscured some of its most compelling evidence in plain sight. Today, the Ellsworth case serves as a poignant reminder of that overlooked evidence. It illustrates how, even in 1953, highly trained personnel were reporting encounters that eluded explanation, instances that hinted at advancements in technology yet unknown. For the crew aboard that B-52 and the controllers at Ellsworth, that night would remain indelible in their memories. They had gazed skyward, witnessing something that should not have existed, a phenomenon that deftly evaded their pursuit, confounded their instruments, and ultimately vanished into the cosmos. And though Project Blue Book filed it away, the memory of that luminous intruder over South Dakota remains, another fragment of history preserved in first-hand accounts and radar logs that point toward a mystery which continues to captivate. The RAF Bentwaters audio tape, December 26th to 28th, 1980, Suffolk, England. the static crackles cutting through the silence. There's no mistaking it. A voice, strained and hushed, declares that there is some peculiar flashing red light up ahead. Click. Another voice chimes in with a certainty that carries the weight of urgency. It is definitely approaching. Now we can observe what appears to be a beam reaching down to the ground. The timestamp etched onto the cassette recorder reads 2 a.m. These voices belong to U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt and his security team. Deep within the Rendlesham Forest, near RAF Bentwaters, a British airbase leased to the United States throughout the Cold War, the scene unfolds. This marks the second night of a UFO sighting that has perplexed personnel and defied official explanations for over 40 years. However, this case is unique. The entire episode was captured live in real time. What transpired over those 3 days in December 1980 would eventually become one of the most meticulously documented UFO incidents in history. This documentation did not rely solely on radar data, indistinct footage, or second-hand narratives, but was instead grounded in the direct observations of the deputy base commander, who recorded everything with a simple tape recorder. This was not an account from a civilian or a farmer narrating strange luminous phenomena. This was the deputy base commander of a joint NATO air base housing nuclear weapons, articulating an encounter with something unknown, utterly inexplicable, and, by all appearances, technologically advanced. It all began on the night of December 26th, when Airman First Class John Burroughs and Sergeant Bud Steffens discerned lights descending into the woods just beyond the perimeter fence. Suspecting that an aircraft may have plummeted, they promptly alerted control. Given the authorization to investigate, they were joined by Airman Jim Penniston. What they discovered defied comprehension. Their descriptions of a triangular craft with radiant panels, approximately 9 feet wide and 6 feet high, were vivid. The craft hovered silently just above the forest floor, an otherworldly presence that Penniston approached closely enough to touch. He later recounted seeing mysterious symbols inscribed upon its hull, reminiscent of hieroglyphs. This enigmatic craft soon ascended vertically through the trees and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The following day, Penniston began experiencing vivid dreams filled with sequences of binary code that he felt compelled to document. In time, he would submit those notes to researchers, igniting decades of discussions surrounding their significance. Initially, base leadership dismissed the unusual event, yet soon came the second night. Colonel Charles Halt, skeptical in the beginning, received reports of strange lights appearing once again amid the woods. Resolute in the desire to settle the matter once and for all, he gathered a team of security personnel, armed himself with a handheld radiation meter and a starlight scope, and, crucially, brought along a cassette tape recorder. What he documented during this encounter would later be recognized as the Halt tape, a gripping 18 minutes in length that chronicles Halt and his men coming face to face with a pulsating red, glowing object in the depths of the forest. They measured radiation levels at the landing site, uncovering physical impressions in the terrain. Subsequently, the object moved swiftly through the trees before shooting into the sky and emitting beams of light directed downward, one of which landed mere feet away from them. Observing what appeared to be a beam projecting down to the ground, Halt uttered the words that would resonate in the annals of UFO lore. "This is unreal." That night, additional lights manifested in the heavens, some maneuvering in ways that defied physics. Halt and his team pursued these anomalies through the wooded area, vocally relaying their immediate observations into the recording device. Their tones conveyed calm urgency, yet it was clear that these seasoned individuals were profoundly unsettled. The audio, with its grainy texture and eerie authenticity, would evolve into one of the most compelling pieces of evidence regarding unidentified flying objects ever disclosed. There was no conjecture, no embellishment. Rather, it was merely the insights of military professionals ensnared in the midst of an inexplicable encounter. Initially, the British Ministry of Defense showed scant interest in the events. Their official stance, which reverberated through the decades, was that the incident posed no threat to national security. Yet documents later procured through Freedom of Information requests unveiled that the Ministry of Defense had been covertly monitoring the situation, with memos acknowledging unidentified aerial phenomena over RAF Bentwaters and adjacent RAF Woodbridge. U.S. authorities exhibited even greater elusiveness. The incident report filed by HALT, known as the HALT Memo, remained classified and hidden for years before it found its way into public view. This document detailed a potential unidentified craft sighting, including impressions left in the ground, elevated radiation readings, and visual validation provided by numerous U.S. Air Force personnel. To this day, neither government has proffered a satisfactory explanation, and the witnesses have steadfastly upheld their accounts. Both Peniston and Burroughs maintained their testimonies, despite diverging narratives as the years rolled on. Peniston asserted that the craft communicated with him on a telepathic level, while Burroughs later faced medical complications and engaged in a protracted legal struggle with the VA. His case gained traction with the eventual declassification, affirming that RAF Bentwaters had stored tactical nuclear weapons at that time, a fact strenuously denied by both governments for years. Quite intriguingly, Burroughs ultimately received full medical disability coverage for injuries sustained during the Rendlesham incident. The court ruling acknowledged that he had been exposed to an unidentified phenomenon while serving. This recognition alone serves as a rare, albeit indirect, acquiescence that something extraordinary transpired within those woods. In 2010, Colonel Halt shattered years of silence, addressing a conference in Washington, D.C., stating unequivocally, "This was not some figment of imagination. I saw it." Many others shared the experience. It was indeed a tangible reality. He further elaborated that radar operators stationed at RAF Watton had monitored a rapidly moving object during the unfolding events, but were instructed to remain silent. Interest in the Rendlesham case surged once more in the 2000s, ignited by UFO researchers and journalists alike. The British Ministry of Defense subsequently declassified additional documents, many of which were heavily redacted, asserting once again that no threat had been established, yet the evidence stubbornly endured. The Halt tape underwent rigorous examination for authenticity and was deemed consistent with the recording standards of the 1980s. No alterations had been made. The ambient sounds recorded in the forest harmonized seamlessly with the Rendlesham landscape. Photographs of ground impressions taken at the scene revealed a distinctive tripod pattern, and the radiation levels measured by Halt's team indicated notable anomalies above the usual background norms. Numerous airmen filed sworn affidavits detailing their observations of that night. However, the most compelling evidence lies in the silence surrounding the event. To this day, neither the governments of the United States nor the United Kingdom have provided a credible explanation for what was observed. No aircraft was reported missing, no experimental flights were noted, and the skies were clear. The radar signals were undeniable. The audio recording is genuine. The witnesses are credible. Yet, the incident remains unresolved. Unlike the Roswell case, there were no materials recovered. In contrast to Phoenix, no large-scale civilian breakout occurred. What sets Rendlesham apart, and the Halt tape in particular, is the immediacy of the moment. Listeners are transported directly into the fray. They can hear the palpable tension, the unfolding confusion, and the awe, all captured in real time. Colonel Halt has expressed a desire that this event had never taken place. However, he acknowledges it did happen and insists the evidence is irrefutable. It seems fitting that this incident, one of the most clearly documented and credible UFO encounters in modern history, occurred not in secret, but through sound, recorded on a modest tape deck wielded by a skeptical officer on a quest for truth. He succeeded, and he hit record. Grand Forks Disc, 1956, Grand Forks, North Dakota. The object stopped abruptly, as though an invisible hand grasped it. There was no drifting, no arc, nothing in the sky behaved like that. This was the account provided by Deputy Sheriff Carl R. Iverson, witness statement, August 1956. Late summer in North Dakota, is characterized by expansive, clear afternoons when the sky above the Red River Valley stretches infinitely from one horizon to the other. In 1956, Grand Forks was encircled by vast swaths of flat farmland, punctuated only by grain elevators and occasional clusters of trees. The openness of this terrain facilitated the observation of aerial movements, from commercial flights making their way east toward Minneapolis to light civilian aircraft navigating local routes. On the afternoon of August 25th, this same unclouded sky became the backdrop for a sighting that would garner documentation from multiple independent witnesses. A metallic disk was seen under optimal daytime visibility, ultimately preserved in the files of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena for its clarity and consistency. The first recorded account emerged from Deputy Sheriff Iverson, who was cruising west on Highway 2 shortly after 4:30 in the afternoon. His attention was captured by a bright metallic gleam reflecting sunlight from a high altitude. Initially presuming it to be a small aircraft banking away, he slowed his patrol car to maintain visual contact. The reflection flared once more, followed by the silhouette of a round, flattened object gliding southeast across the sky. In his official report, Iverson characterized it as circular, silvery, with a constant brightness, estimating a diameter of 30 to 40 feet. Given the distance, visibility conditions on that day were exceptional. Weather records from the Grand Forks station indicated clear skies with visibility exceeding 15 miles, accompanied by gentle winds originating from the west at 4 miles per hour. The object's estimated altitude ranged between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, comfortably above local crop dusting flights, yet below the cruising altitude of commercial airliners. Iverson observed the disk maintain a straight, level trajectory for several seconds before it suddenly ceased movement. He would later remark that there was no deceleration, it merely halted. This detail resurfaced in other witness testimonies. Almost concurrently, two mechanics laboring outside a garage near downtown Grand Forks witnessed the same object. Their statements, collected independently by local authorities, each described a round, silver object advancing from the northwest. One mechanic, Leonard Wilcox, remarked that the object shone like polished metal, brilliant but steadfast. His colleague, Calvin Dorsey, noted a slight tilt of the object before it leveled off, a motion he compared to a plate being turned in hand before resting flat. This subtle tilt would become a pivotal point of description in the NICAP files. While these observations unfolded, an officer with the Grand Forks Police Department, stationed near the city's periphery, reported spotting a luminous round shape progressing steadily across the open sky. He estimated its size to be larger than a private aircraft, yet smaller than a transport, not entirely certain of the exact dimensions. The officer later documented that the object's movement was smooth and straight, there was no wobbling, and its sudden stop was instantaneous. The disk resumed its course mere seconds after its halt, accelerating rapidly toward the south before executing a sharp turn to the east. Iverson noted that this maneuver lacked the gradual curve characteristic of an aircraft banking. Witnesses echoed similar sentiments, remarking on the absence of banking, rolling, or any visible control surfaces. As the object navigated eastward, a civilian pilot navigating a small single-engine aircraft close to the Grand Forks airfield caught sight of it. The pilot, recorded as A.J. Remmer in the CIA log, reported glimpsing a luminous round object at a high altitude, hurtling eastward at an impressive speed. Attempting to gauge its velocity relative to his own aircraft, Remmer deduced that the unidentified object was traveling substantially faster than 300 miles per hour, a rate that seemed remarkable for an object of its shape and elevation. He also made a noteworthy observation. Despite the tranquil wind conditions, the object was utterly silent. By 4:45 p.m., the enigmatic disk had become visible from numerous locations throughout Grand Forks. A family journeying north of the city described its ascent as reminiscent of a silver coin spinning skyward. Their account, documented the following day, corroborated the timing and general description offered by other observers, even though they had no known interaction with the initial group of witnesses. Local authorities were inundated with calls about the sighting. Dispatch records reflect that callers reported a shiny spherical object, an incandescent disk, or a glimmering light moving with unusual rapidity. Notably, none of the attendees mentioned any sound accompanying the sighting. The uniformity of these accounts compelled the sheriff's office to consolidate them into a comprehensive incident summary. NICAP later secured access to these summaries and conducted their own thorough review. The organization's analysts expressed particular interest in the object's impressive maneuverability, its abrupt cessation of motion, the sharp change in direction, and the rapid ascent into the sky. One analyst scribbled a margin note, stating that the motion signatures did not align with any known aircraft profiles. Another, addressing the clarity of the daylight conditions, remarked on the ideal visibility, emphasizing that there was no atmospheric distortion impeding observation. Central to NICAP's investigation was the reflective quality of the object. Witnesses described a consistent metallic sheen, distinguishing it sharply from the irregular or pulsing reflections typical of aircraft fuselages capturing sunlight at varying angles. Iverson, Wilcox, Dorsey, and Remmer each characterized the surface of the disk as bright and uniformly reflective. A NICAP review sheet noted that the light reflection hinted at a solid surface composed of consistent material. Weather data from the Grand Forks region further reinforced the reliability of the visual accounts. With no cloud cover below 20,000 feet and no atmospheric anomalies such as inversion layers or ice crystals capable of creating mirage effects, the conditions were optimal for observation. The stable air mass ensured that distant aircraft lights or reflective surfaces would remain unclouded by distortion. NICAP's compilation included a notation stating clear skies, low winds, and ideal visual conditions. Another critical aspect preserved in the NICAP file was the alignment among independent witnesses. Although no two individuals watched the disk from the same vantage point, their descriptions of its motion, shape, and brightness consistently reflected striking similarities. Iverson's patrol notes, the mechanic's written statements, the police officer's report, and the pilot's submission to the CIA all recounted the sighting of a circular object exhibiting sudden movements while maintaining a steady orientation. The organization also scrutinized any mundane explanations for the phenomenon. During the time frame of the sighting, no military aircraft were reported in the vicinity. The nearby Grand Forks Air Force Base confirmed that no jets were airborne at that time. Additionally, the Civil Aeronautics Administration verified that no transient or high-altitude traffic traversed the corridor described by witnesses. A NICAP analyst noted in the documentation that the air corridor was quiet, with no scheduled flights reported in the observed path. The object's abrupt halt and swift acceleration particularly captured the attention of NICAP staff. Aircraft of that era necessitated gradual deceleration and banking maneuvers to change course, and none were capable of achieving the steep vertical ascent that was reported. Investigation notes, documented years later, stated that the observed maneuvers exceeded the performance envelope of available aircraft, maintaining a neutral tone while clearly indicating that the object's movements did not conform to known technology. As NICAP assembled its case summary, it emphasized the diversity of its witnesses, individuals from law enforcement, mechanics, civilians, and a licensed pilot, all describing the same behavior. Their independent perspectives allowed the organization to cross-reference the object's trajectory across the city, approximating its path from the northwest to southeast before it ascended sharply. One particularly notable aspect of the case was the absence of sound. The mechanics stationed near the garage were accustomed to the auditory backdrop of aircraft overhead, and Iverson's patrol route frequently brought him close to low-flying planes, either departing from or approaching the local airfield. None of these individuals reported engine noise, rotor sounds, or any other discernible acoustic signatures. A NICAP technician added in the case files that silence was consistently noted across all statements. In the years following the incident, NICAP continued to reference the Grand Forks disk as a prime example of a high-quality daytime sighting. It embodied the characteristics they esteemed: numerous witnesses, transparent atmospheric conditions, detailed descriptions, and consistent accounts of maneuverability. The case was included in internal evaluations of mid-1950s disk sightings and later cross-referenced with similar occurrences in Minnesota and Montana during that time period. By the completion of NIKAP's compilation, the Grand Forks file had evolved into a concise yet robust record. The final summary articulated the observation of a metallic disk under clear conditions by multiple witnesses, highlighting its hovering, abrupt stopping, sharp directional change, and rapid vertical climb with no conventional explanation. Documented. Throughout the reporting process, the language remained neutral, reflecting only the accounts as described. The case occupies a place in NICAP's archive as a meticulous and factual entry. A serene moment unfolded above the tranquil expanse of North Dakota as a metallic disk traversed the sky in broad daylight, observed by individuals familiar with the area who possessed a keen understanding of its aviation activities. They characterized the object in straightforward and uniform expressions. Their descriptions remained steady and unembellished, echoing the reality they witnessed during that afternoon when a round and luminous entity glided across Grand Forks, pausing momentarily, executing a sharp turn, and then ascending rapidly until the sky enveloped it completely. You have been tuning into Night Archive, and it is important to remember to like and subscribe so that you remain connected to tomorrow's narrative. Daily, new tales of alien encounters and UFO incidents await your discovery here.